Section 27 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. The Indian Mutiny, A.D. 1857. J. Talboys Whaler. Meanwhile, the brain of Nana Sahib had been turned by wild dreams of vengeance and sovereignty. He thought not only to wreak his malice upon the English, but to restore the extinct Maratha Empire and reign over Hindustan as the representative of the forgotten Peshwas. The stampede of the sepoys to Delhi was fatal to his mad ambition. He overtook the mutineers, dazzled them with fables of the treasures in Wheeler's entrenchment, and brought them back to Cawnpore to carry out his vindictive and visionary schemes. At early morning on Saturday, June 6th, General Wheeler received from Nana a letter announcing that he was about to attack the entrenchment. The veteran was taken by surprise, but at once ordered all the European officers to join the party in the barracks and prepare for the defense. But the mutineers were in no hurry for the advance. They preferred booty to battle and turned aside to plunder the cantonment and city, murdering every Christian that came in their way, not sparing the houses of their own countrymen. They appropriated all the cannon and ammunition in the magazine by way of preparation for the siege. But some were wise enough to desert the rebel army and steal to their homes with their ill-gotten spoil. About noon, the main body of the mutineers, swelled by the numerous retainers of Nana, got their guns into position and opened fire on the entrenchment. For 19 days, from June 6th to the 25th, the garrison struggled manfully against a raking fire and fearful odds amid scenes of suffering and bloodshed that cannot be recalled without a shudder. It was the height of the hot weather in Hindustan. A blazing sun was burning over the heads of the besieged, and to add to their misery, one of the barracks containing the sick and wounded was destroyed by fire. The besiegers, however, in spite of their overwhelming numbers, were utterly unable to carry the entrenchment by storm, but continued to pour in a raking fire. Meanwhile, the garrison was starving from want of provisions and hampered by a multitude of helpless women and children. Indeed, but for the latter contingency, the gallant band would have rushed out of the entrenchment and cut a way through the mob of sepoys or perished in the attempt. As it was, they could only fight on, waiting for reinforcements that never came, until fever, sunstroke, hunger, madness, or the enemy's fire delivered them from their suffering and despair. On June 25th, a woman brought a slip of writing from Nana promising to give a safe passage to Allahabad to all who were willing to lay down their arms. Had there been no women or children, the garrison would never have dreamed of surrender. The massacre at Patna, a century before, had taught a lesson to Englishmen which ought never to have been forgotten. As it was, there were some who wished to fight on till the bitter end, but the majority saw that there was no hope for the women or the children, the sick or the wounded, except by accepting the proffered terms. Accordingly, the pride of Englishmen gave way and an armistice was proclaimed. Next morning, the terms were negotiated. The English garrison were to surrender their position, their guns, and their treasure, but to march out with their arms and with 60 rounds of ammunition in the pouch of every man. Nana Sahib, on his part, was to afford a safe conduct to the river bank about a mile off, to provide carriage for the conveyance of the women and children, the sick and the wounded, and to furnish boats for carrying the whole party, numbering some 450 individuals, down the river Ganges to Allahabad. Nana accepted the terms but demanded the evacuation of the entrenchment that very night. General Wheeler protested against this proviso. Nana began to bully and to threaten that he would open fire. He was told that he might carry the entrenchment if he could, but that the English had enough powder left to blow both armies into the air. Accordingly, Nana agreed to wait until the morrow. At early morning on June 27th, the garrison began to move from the entrenchment to the place of embarkation. The men marched on foot. The women and children were carried on elephants and in bullock carts, while the wounded were mostly conveyed in palanquins. 40 boats with thatched roofs, known as budgerows, were moored in shallow water at a little distance from the bank, and the crowd of fugitives were forced to wade through the river to the boats. By 9 o'clock, the whole 450 were huddled on board, and the boats prepared to leave Cawnpore. Suddenly, a bugle was sounded, and a murderous fire of grape shot and musketry was opened upon the wretched passengers from both sides of the river. At the same time, the thatching of many of the budgerows was found to be on fire, and the flames began to spread from boat to boat. Numbers were murdered in the river, but at last the firing ceased. A few escaped down the river, but only 4 men survived to tell the story of the massacre. A mass of fugitives were dragged ashore, the women and children, to the number of 125, were carried off and lodged in a house near the headquarters of Nana. The men were ordered to immediate execution. One of them had preserved a prayer book and was permitted to read a few sentences of the liturgy to his doomed companions. Then the fatal order was given. The sepoys poured in a volley of musketry, and all was over. On July 1st, Nana Sahib went off to his palace at Bithor and was proclaimed Peshwa. He took his seat upon the throne and was installed with all the ceremonies of sovereignty, while the cannon roared out a salute in his honor. At night, the whole place was illuminated, and the hours of darkness were whiled away with feasting and fireworks. But his triumph was short lived. The Mahometans were plotting against him at Cawnpore. The people were leaving the city to escape the coming storm and were taking refuge in the villages. English reinforcements were at last coming up from Allahabad, while the greedy sepoys were clamoring for money and gold bangles. Accordingly, Nana hastened back to Cawnpore and scattered wealth with a lavish hand, and sought to hide his fears by boastful proclamations and to drown his anxieties in drink and debauchery. Within a few days more, the number of helpless prisoners was increased to 200. There had been a mutiny at Fatehgarh, higher up the river, and the fugitives had fled in boats to Cawnpore, a distance of 80 miles. They knew nothing of what had happened and were all taken prisoners by the rebels and brought on shore. The men were all butchered in the presence of Nana. The women and children, 80 in number, were sent to join the wretched sufferers in the house near Nana's headquarters. Meanwhile, Colonel Neil, commanding the Madras Fusiliers, was pushing up from Calcutta. He was bent on the relief of Cawnpore and Lucknow, but was delayed on the way by the mutinies at Benares and Allahabad. In July, he was joined at Allahabad by a column under General Havelock, who was destined within a few weeks to win a lasting name in history. General Havelock was a Queen's officer of 40 years' standing, but he had seen more service in India than perhaps any other officer in Her Majesty's army. He had fought in the First Burma War, the Kabul War, the Gwalior Campaign of 1843, and the Punjab Campaign of 1845-46. He was a pale, thin, thoughtful man, small in stature, but burning with the aspirations of a Puritan hero. Religion was the ruling principle of his life, and military glory was his master passion. He had just returned to India after commanding a division in the Persian War. Abstemious to a fault, he was able, in spite of his advancing years, to bear up against the heat and rain of Hindustan during the deadliest season of the year. On July 7th, General Havelock left Allahabad for Cawnpore. The force at his disposal did not exceed 2,000 men, Europeans and Sikhs. He had heard of the massacre at Cawnpore on June 27th and burned to avenge it. On July 12th, he defeated a large force of mutineers and Marathas at Fatehpur. On the 15th, he inflicted two more defeats on the enemy. Havelock was now within 22 miles of Cawnpore, and he halted his men to rest for the night. But news arrived that the women and children were still alive at Cawnpore and that Nana had taken the field with a large force to oppose his advance. Accordingly, Havelock marched 14 miles that same night, and on the following morning, within 8 miles of Cawnpore, the troops bivouacked beneath some trees. On that same night, July 15th, the crowning atrocity was committed at Cawnpore. The rebels, who had been defeated by Havelock, returned to Nana with the tidings of their disaster. In revenge, Nana ordered the slaughter of the 200 women and children. The poor victims were literally hacked to death, or almost to death, with swords, bayonets, knives, and axes. Next morning, the bleeding remains of dead and dying were dragged to a neighboring well and thrown in. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon after the massacre, the force under Havelock was again upon the march for Cawnpore. The heat was fearful. Many of the troops were struck down by the sun, and the cries for water were continuous. But for 2 miles, the column toiled on and then came in sight of the enemy. Havelock had only 1,000 Europeans and 300 Sikhs. He had no cavalry, and his artillery was inferior. The enemy numbered 5,000 men, armed and trained by British officers, strongly entrenched with 2 batteries of guns of heavy caliber. Havelock's artillery failed to silence the batteries, and he ordered the Europeans to charge with the bayonet. On they went in the face of a shower of grape, but the bayonet charge was as irresistible at Cawnpore as at Assaye. The enemy fought for a while like men in a death struggle. Nana Sahib was with them, but nothing is known of his exploits. At last they fled, and there was no cavalry to pursue them. As yet, nothing was known of the butchery of the women and children. Havelock halted for the night and next morning marched his force into the station at Cawnpore. The men beheld the scene of the massacre and saw the bleeding remains in the well. But the murderers had vanished, no one knew whither. Havelock advanced to Bithur and destroyed the palace of the Maratha. Subsequently, he was joined by General Neil, with reinforcements from Allahabad. And on July 20th, he set on for the relief of Lucknow, leaving Kanpur in charge of General Neil. The defense of Lucknow against 52,000 rebels was, next to the siege of Delhi, the greatest event in the mutiny. The whole province of Oudh was in a blaze of insurrection. The talukdars were exasperated at the hard measure dealt out to them before the appointment of Sir Henry Lawrence as Chief Commissioner. Disbanded sepoys, returning to their homes in Oudh, swelled the tide of disaffection. Bandits that had been suppressed under British administration returned to their old work of robbery and brigandage. All classes took advantage of the anarchy to murder the moneylenders. Meanwhile, the country was bristling with the fortresses of the talukdars, and the cultivators, deprived of the protection of the English, naturally flocked for refuge to the strongholds of their old masters. The English, who had been lords of Hindustan ever since the beginning of the century, had been closely besieged in the residency at Lucknow ever since the final outbreak of May 30th. For nearly 2 months, the garrison had held out with a dauntless intrepidity while confidently waiting for reinforcements that seemed never to come. Never surrender had been from the first the passionate conviction of Sir Henry Lawrence, and the massacre at Kanpur on June 27th impressed every soldier in the garrison with a like resolution. On July 2nd, the Muchi Bhavan was abandoned and the garrison and stores were removed to the residency. On July 4th, Sir Henry Lawrence was killed by the bursting of a shell in a room where he lay wounded, and his dying counsel to those around him was never surrender. On July 20th, the rebel force round Lucknow heard of the advance of General Havelock to Kanpur and attacked the residency in overwhelming force. They kept up a continual fire of musketry while pounding away with their heavy guns. But the garrison held their ground against shot and shell, and before the day was over, the dense masses of assailants were forced to retire from the walls. Between July 20th and 25th, General Havelock began to cross the Ganges and make his way into Oudh territory, but he was unable to relieve Lucknow. His small force was weakened by heat and fever and reduced by cholera and dysentery, while the enemy occupied strong positions on both flanks. In the middle of August, he fell back upon Kanpur. During the 4 months that followed the revolt at Delhi on May 11th, all political interest was centered at the ancient capital of the sovereigns of Hindustan. The public mind was occasionally distracted by the current of events at Kanpur and Lucknow, as well as at other stations, which need not be particularized. But so long as Delhi remained in the hands of the rebels, the native princes were bewildered and alarmed, and its prompt recapture was deemed of vital importance to the prestige of the British government and the re-establishment of British sovereignty in Hindustan. The great Mughal had been little better than a mummy for more than half a century, and Bahadur Shah was a mere tool and puppet in the hands of rebel sepoys. Nevertheless, the British government had to deal with the astounding fact that the rebels were fighting under his name and standard, just as Afghans and Marathas had done in the days of Ahmad Shah Durrani and Mahadaji Sindhya. To make matters worse, the roads to Delhi were open from the south and the east, and nearly every outbreak in Hindustan was followed by a stampede of mutineers to the old capital of the Mughals. Meanwhile, in the absence of railways, There were unfortunate delays in bringing up troops and guns to stamp out the fires of rebellion at the head center. The highway from Calcutta to Delhi was blocked up by mutiny and insurrection, and every European soldier sent up from Calcutta was stopped for the relief of Benares, Allahabad, Kanpur, or Lucknow. But the possession of the Punjab at this crisis proved to be the salvation of the empire. Sir John Lawrence, Chief Commissioner in the Punjab, was called upon for almost superhuman work to maintain order in a conquered province, to suppress mutiny and disaffection among the very sepoy regiments from Bengal that were supposed to garrison the country, and to send reinforcements of troops and guns and supplies of all descriptions to the siege of Delhi. Fortunately, the Sikhs had been only a few short years under British administration. They had not forgotten the miseries that prevailed under the native government and could appreciate the many blessings they enjoyed under British rule. They were stanch to the British government and eager to be led against the rebels. In some cases, terrible punishment was meted out to mutinous Bengal sepoys within the Punjab, but the imperial interests at stake were sufficient to justify every severity, although all must regret the painful necessity that called for such extreme measures. On June 8th, about a month after the revolt at Delhi, Sir Henry Bernard took the field at Alipur, about 10 miles from the rebel capital. He defeated an advanced division of the enemy and then marched to the ridge and reoccupied the old cantonment which had been abandoned on May 11th. So far, it was clear that the rebels were unable to do anything in the open field, although they might fight bravely under cover. They numbered about 30,000 strong. They had a very powerful artillery and ample stores of ammunition, while there was an abundance of provisions within the city throughout the siege. In the middle of August, Brigadier John Nicholson, one of the most distinguished officers of the time, came up from the Punjab with a brigade and siege train. On September 4th, a heavy train of artillery was brought in from Firozpur. The British force on the ridge now exceeded 8,000 men. Hitherto, the artillery had been too weak to attempt to breach the city walls, but now 54 heavy guns were brought into position and the siege began in earnest. From September 8th to 12th, 4 batteries poured in a constant storm of shot and shell. Number 1 was directed against the Kashmir bastion, number 2 against the right flank of the Kashmir bastion, number 3 against the Walter bastion, and number 4 against the Kashmir and Watergates and bastions. On September 13th, the breaches were declared to be practicable, and the following morning was fixed for the final assault upon the doomed city. At 3 o'clock in the morning of September 14th, 3 assaulting columns were formed in the trenches, while a 4th was kept in reserve. The first column was led by Brigadier Nicholson, the second by Brigadier Jones, the third by Colonel Campbell, and the 4th or reserve by Brigadier Longfield. The powder bags were laid at the Kashmir Gate by Lieutenants Home and Salkeld. The explosion followed, and the third column rushed in and pushed toward the Juma Masjid. Meanwhile, the first column under Nicholson escalated the breaches near the Kashmir Gate and pushed along the ramparts towards the Kabul Gate, carrying the several bastions in the way. Here it was met by the second column under Brigadier Jones, who had escalated the breach at the Water Bastion. The advancing columns were met by a ceaseless fire from terraced houses, mosques, and other buildings. and John Nicholson, the hero of the day, while attempting to storm a narrow street near the Kabul gate, was struck down by a shot and mortally wounded. Then followed 6 days of desperate warfare. No quarter was given to men with arms in their hands, but women and children were spared, and only a few of the peaceable inhabitants were sacrificed during the storm. On September 20th, the gates of the old fortified palace of the Mughals were broken open, but the royal inmates had fled. No one was left but a few wounded sepoys and fugitive fanatics. The old King Bahadur Shah had gone off to the great mausoleum without the city, known as the Tomb of Humayun. It was a vast quadrangle raised on terraces and enclosed with walls. It contained towers, buildings, and monumental marbles in memory of different members of the once distinguished family, as well as extensive gardens surrounded with cloistered cells for the accommodation of pilgrims. On September 21st, Captain Hodgson rode to the tomb, arrested the king, and brought him back to Delhi with other members of the family and lodged them in the palace. The next day he went again with 100 horsemen and arrested two sons of the king in the midst of a crowd of armed retainers and brought them away in a native carriage. Near the city, the carriage was surrounded by a tumultuous crowd, and Hodgson, who was afraid of a rescue, shot both princes with his pistol and placed their bodies in a public place for all men to see. Thus fell the imperial city, captured by the army under Brigadier Wilson before the arrival of any of the reinforcements from England. The losses were heavy. From the beginning of the siege to the close, the British army at Delhi had nearly 4,000 killed and wounded. The casualties on the side of the rebels were never estimated. Two bodies of sepoys broke away from the city and fled down the valleys of the Jamna and Ganges, followed by two flying columns under Brigadiers Greathead and Showers. But the great mutiny and revolt at Delhi had been stamped out, and the flag of England waved triumphantly over the capital of Hindustan. The capture of Delhi in September 1857 was the turning point in the Sepoy mutinies. The revolt was crushed beyond redemption. The rebels were deprived of their head center, and the Mughal king was a prisoner at the mercy of the power whom he had defied. But there were still troubles in India. Lucknow was still beleaguered by a rebel army, and insurrection still ran riot in Oudh and Rohilkhand. In the middle of August, General Havelock had fallen back on Cawnpore after the failure of his first campaign for the relief of Lucknow. 5 weeks afterward, Havelock made a second attempt under better auspices. Sir Colin Campbell had arrived at Calcutta as Commander in Chief. Sir James Outram had come up to Allahabad. On September 16th, while the British troops were storming the streets of Delhi, Outram joined Havelock and Neil at Cawnpore with 1,400 men. As senior officer, he might have assumed the command, but with generous chivalry, the Baird of India waived his rank in honor of Havelock. On September 20th, General Havelock crossed the Ganges into Oudh at the head of 2,500 men. The next day, he defeated a rebel army and put it to flight, while 4 of the enemy's guns were captured by Outram at the head of a body of volunteer cavalry. On the 23rd, Havelock routed a still larger rebel force, which was strongly posted at a garden in the suburbs of Lucknow, known as the Alambagh. He then halted to give his soldiers a day's rest. On the 25th, he was cutting his way through the streets and lanes of the city of Lucknow. running the gauntlet of a deadly and unremitting fire from the houses on both sides of the streets and also from guns which commanded them. On the evening of the same day, he entered the British entrenchments, but in the moment of victory, a chance shot carried off the gallant nail. The defense of the British residency at Lucknow is a glorious episode in the national annals. The fortitude of the beleaguered garrison was the admiration of the world. The women nursed the wounded and performed every womanly duty with self sacrificing heroism. And when the fight was over, they received the well merited thanks of Her Majesty Queen Victoria. During 4 long months, the garrison had known nothing of what was going on in the outer world. They were aware of the advance and retreat of Havelock, and that was all. At last, on September 23rd, they heard the booming of the guns at the Alambagh. On the morning of the 25th, they could see something of the growing excitement in the city, the people abandoning their houses and flying across the river. Still, the guns of the rebels kept up a heavy cannonade upon the residency, and volleys of musketry continued to pour upon the besieged from the loopholes of the besiegers. But soon the firing was heard from the city. The welcome sounds came nearer and nearer. The excitement of the garrison grew beyond control. Presently, the relieving force was seen fighting its way toward the residency. Then the pent up feelings of the garrison burst forth in deafening cheers, and wounded men in hospital crawled out to join in the chorus of welcome. Then followed personal greetings as officers and men came pouring in. Hands were frantically shaken on all sides. Rough bearded soldiers took the children from their mothers' arms, kissed them with tears rolling down their cheeks, and thanked God that they had come in time to save them from the fate of the sufferers at Cawnpore. Thus, after a siege of nearly 4 months, Havelock succeeded in relieving Lucknow. But it was a reinforcement rather than a relief and was confined to the British residency. The siege was not raised, and the city of Lucknow remained 2 months longer in the hands of the rebels. Sir James Outram assumed the command but was compelled to keep on the defensive. Meanwhile, reinforcements were arriving from England. In November, Sir Colin Campbell reached Cawnpore at the head of a considerable army. He left General Windham with 2,000 men to take charge of the entrenchment at Cawnpore and then advanced against Lucknow with 5,000 men and 30 guns. He carried several of the enemy's positions, cut his way to the residency, and at last brought away the beleaguered garrison with all the women and children. But not even then could he disperse the rebels and reoccupy the city. Accordingly, he left Outram at the head of 4,000 men in the neighborhood of Lucknow and then returned to Cawnpore. On November 24th, the day after leaving Lucknow, General Havelock was carried off by dysentery and buried in the Alambagh. His death spread a gloom over India, but by this time his name had become a household word wherever the English language was spoken. In the hour of surprise and panic, as successive stories of mutiny and rebellion reached England and culminated in the revolt at Delhi and massacre at Cawnpore, the victories of Havelock revived the drooping spirits of the British nation and stirred up all hearts to glorify the hero who had stemmed the tide of disaffection and disaster. The death of Havelock, following the story of the capture of Delhi, and told with the same breath that proclaimed the deliverance at Lucknow, was received in England with a universal sorrow that will never be forgotten so long as men are living who can recall the memory of the Mutiny of 57. The subsequent history of the Sepoy Revolt is little more than a detail of the military operations of British troops for the dispersion of the rebels and restoration of order and law. Sir Colin Campbell, start footnote, died at Chatham, England, August 14, 1863 ED. End footnote. Later made Baron Clyde of Clydesdale, undertook a general campaign against the rebels in Oudh and Rohilkhand and restored order and law in those disaffected provinces, while Sir James Outram drove the rebels out of Lucknow and re established British sovereignty in the capital of Oudh. End of section 27.
Section 28 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Battles of Magenta and Solferino, A.D. 1859, by Pietro Orsi. During the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, Austria remained neutral, while the Italian kingdom of Sardinia joined Great Britain, France, and Turkey against Russia. The power of Austria still kept despotic sway over the states of Italy, and it was the aim of Victor Emmanuel, King of Sardinia, to throw off this hindrance to Italian liberty and union. It was the opinion of Count Cavour, Victor Emmanuel's minister, that by acting with the Allies against Russia, Sardinia would increase her prestige with the European powers and thereby promote the movement for independence. The success of the Allies in the Crimean War confirmed the prescience of Cavour. Napoleon III wished to secure for France supremacy in southern Europe. In 1855, he inquired of the Sardinian minister, "What can I do for Italy?" The Crimean War ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1856. At the Congress which concluded that peace, Cavour presented the case of Italy against Austria. Not long after this, it became evident that Napoleon was prepared to espouse the Italian cause. In 1858, it was agreed that he should do this. Sardinia now prepared for war. Austria sent an ultimatum demanding a reduction of the Sardinian army to a peace footing. This demand was refused. In January 1859, Austria mobilized fresh troops on the Italian frontier, and Cavour requested Garibaldi to organize a volunteer corps to be called Cacciatori delle Alpi, Hunters of the Alps. Still, Cavour disclaimed a warlike policy, denying that the hostile initiative was taken by Sardinia, although in this position he was opposed by some members of his own parliament. Nevertheless, Cavour declared, "I believe I am justified in proclaiming aloud, in the presence of Parliament, of the nation, and of Europe, that if there has been provocation, it was offered by Austria." As shown by Orsi, the Italian historian, the great minister maintained this attitude as long as it was possible to hold back from the actual conflict. Cavour insisted that Austria must be the aggressive party, for in the treaty with Napoleon III, it had been stipulated that France would come to the help of Sardinia only in case of the latter being attacked by Austria. Hence, Cavour was obliged to seek every means of putting his country into the attitude of the provoked party. How many disappointments, uncertainties, and anxieties crowded those days from February to the end of April 1859. In order to understand the enormous difficulties overcome by Cavour, it would be necessary to follow literally day by day the history of that period. In March, he repaired to Paris to ascertain Napoleon's action. It was too evident, however, that French public opinion was unfavourable to war, and the Emperor was wavering. Russia and England suggested that the question should be solved by a Congress, to which proposal Napoleon III acceded. Cavour now believed all was lost, since Sardinia could not refuse without putting herself in the wrong. Fortunately, the difficulty was solved by Austria boldly insisting that Sardinia should disarm before being represented at the Congress, and on April 23rd, this demand was enforced by an ultimatum to be answered within 3 days. Now ensued a genuine declaration of hostilities, and most joyfully did Victor Emmanuel make the following announcement to his troops. Quote, "Soldiers, Austria, who masses her armies on our frontiers and threatens to invade our country because liberty and order rule there, because concord and affection between sovereign and people and not force sway the state, because there the anguished cry of oppressed Italy is listened to. Austria dares to tell us, who are armed only in our own defence, to lay down those arms and put ourselves in her power. Such an outrageous suggestion surely merits a condign response, and I have indignantly refused her request. I announce this to you in the certainty that you will make the wrong done to your king and to your nation your own. Hence, mine is a proclamation of war. Arm yourselves, therefore, in readiness for it. You will be confronted by an ancient enemy who is both valiant and disciplined, but against whom you need not fear to measure your strength, for you may remember with pride Goito, Pastrengo, Santa Lucia, Somma Campagna, and above all Custozza, where 4 brigades fought for 3 days against the enemy's 5 corps d'armée. I will be your leader. Your prowess in action has already been tested in the past, and when fighting under my magnanimous father, I myself proudly recognized your valour. I am convinced that on the field of honour and glory you will know how to justify as well as to augment your military renown. You will have as comrades those intrepid French troops, the conquerors in so many distinguished campaigns, with whom you fought side by side at Chennai, whom Napoleon III, always prompt to further the defence of a righteous cause and the victory of civilization, generously sends in great numbers to our aid. March, then, confident of success, and wreath with fresh laurels that standard which, rallying from all quarters the flower of Italian youth to its threefold colours, points out your task of accomplishing that righteous and sacred enterprise, the independence of Italy, wherein we find our war cry." End quote. The Austrian army, to the number of 170,000 men, besides those remaining in the Lombardo-Venetian fortresses, was commanded by General Giulai, the successor of Radetzky, who had died the year before at the age of 91. Giulai meant to attack and rout the Sardinian army before it could join its French allies. On April 29th, he crossed the Ticino. Then, spreading out his forces along the Sesia, he reconnoitred as far as Chivasso. These districts abound in cultivated rice fields and are intersected by many canals. It was therefore easy, by flooding the ground, to hinder the march of the Austrian troops on Turin. Meanwhile, the Sardinian army, composed of 60,000 men, awaited the arrival of the French forces on the right bank of the Po. On May 12th, Napoleon III, already preceded into Italy by 120,000 of his men, debarked at Genoa, and on the 14th was at Alessandria, where, near the mouth of the Tanaro, the Allied armies met. The Austrian troops covered a long tract from Novara to Vercelli, then extended down the line of the Sesia as far as the Po, and thence reached the mouth of the Tanaro. Giulai, seeing the enemy concentrated on the right bank of the Po, believed that Napoleon III intended crossing that river in the direction of Piacenza, as Napoleon I had crossed in 1796, and so massed his troops to the south. At this juncture, a portion of his army encountered the French and Sardinians at Montebello, where the extreme right wing of the Allies was posted. The Austrian general met with such a determined resistance that he imagined this must be the centre of the enemy, and felt convinced that he had guessed the latter's intention. He therefore caused his army to pursue its march southward. By this movement, Vercelli was abandoned by the Austrians, and it was immediately reoccupied by the Sardinians. Napoleon now prepared a bold flank movement by leaving the Po for the Ticino, and to mask this manoeuvre ordered the Sardinians to make an advance. Thus, while Victor Emmanuel, at the head of his men, flung himself from Vercelli on Palestro, meriting by the skill of his military tactics the acclamations of a regiment of Zouaves, whom he headed as corporal, the French, taking advantage of the Alessandria, Casale, and Novara railway, made for the bridge of Buffalora over the Ticino. Only then did Giulai perceive this clever stratagem, which threw Lombardy open to the Allies, and he was consequently obliged to cross the Ticino to block the enemy's way to Milan. On June 4th, at Magenta, nearly the whole of the Austrian army engaged the French forces. The battle, which was most desperate, lasted all day, and was remarkable for the prodigies of valour performed. The Austrians, driven back into Magenta itself, maintained even in that village such a stout resistance that they had to be dislodged by house-to-house fighting. On June 8th, Victor Emmanuel and Napoleon III made their triumphal entry into Milan, now freed from the Austrian yoke. On the same day, a French corps repulsed the Austrians at Melegnano, while Garibaldi entered Bergamo from the other side. Garibaldi, who had been the last to leave Lombardy in 1848, was now the first to set foot in its territory in 1859. Since May 23rd, he had led his own cacciatori to the Lombard shores of Lake Maggiore, had defeated the Austrians at Varese, entered Como, routed the enemy afresh at San Fermo, and was now proceeding to Bergamo and Brescia, with the intention of reaching the Trentina Alps to cut off the enemy's retreat. After the Battle of Magenta, Giulai had been dismissed from the command, and his post was assumed by the Emperor Francis Joseph himself, assisted by the aged Marshal Hesse. On the night of June 23rd, the retreating Austrians crossed the Mincio, but a few hours after retraced their steps and took up their position on the hills to the south of the Lake of Garda. On the morning of the 24th, the Franco-Sardinian army began their march at dawn, and shortly afterward, to their great amazement, encountered the Austrians, who they imagined had crossed the Mincio the night before. The struggle was terrible. In fact, the line covered by the fighting extended a distance of 5 leagues. A series of hills, dominated by Solferino and San Martino, formed the positions the Franco-Sardinian army had to assail. The French contested Solferino with the Austrians, and after a hotly disputed battle of more than 12 hours, succeeded in occupying it. The Sardinians, led by Victor Emmanuel, made a violent assault on San Martino. 4 times in succession did they take it, only to lose it again. But the 5th time they made themselves masters of it, for good and all. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the strength of the Austrian army was everywhere broken. Just then a frightful hurricane, heralded by clouds of dust and accompanied by torrents of rain, burst over the two armies, and thus favoured the flight of the Austrian battalions. Napoleon III now fixed his headquarters at Capriana, in the same house that Francis Joseph had tenanted during the action. On that vast battlefield, the combatants had numbered 300,000 men, 160,000 Austrians and 140,000 French and Sardinians. Of all these, after that sanguinary struggle, 25,000 were left dead or wounded. After a few days' rest, the Franco-Sardinian army crossed the Mincio and besieged Peschiera. Now there seemed a chance of the Italians fulfilling the hope they had so long cherished of expelling the foreigners. They confidently awaited news of fresh feats of arms in the Quadrilateral and of the success of the fleet sent by France and Sardinia into Adriatic waters. But instead came the most unexpected tidings imaginable. On July 8th, Napoleon III had met Francis Joseph, and 3 days later the preliminaries of peace were signed at Villafranca. By this treaty, Austria was to cede Lombardy to Napoleon, who was to relegate it to Sardinia. The Italian states were to be amalgamated into a confederation under the presidency of the Pope. But Venice, though forming part of the same confederation, was to remain under Austrian rule. Great indeed was the mortification of all Italy on hearing such terms of peace announced. Cavour, who had devoted all his marvellous talents to realizing the ideal of national redemption, and had believed his ends so nearly attained, hastened to his prince, and, in a melancholy interview, advised him not to accept such conditions. But Victor Emmanuel, although it caused his very heart to bleed, signed the treaty, adding these words: "I approve, as far as I myself am concerned." Whereupon Cavour sent in his resignation. What was the motive that had induced Napoleon to break his lately made promise of freeing Italy from the Alps to the Adriatic? There were many reasons which influenced him. The sight of that immense battlefield strewn with the bodies of the slain, the determined resistance of the Austrian soldiers, the difficulties which would have to be faced in the Quadrilateral, the hostile attitude of Prussia, were all motives which combined to sway the French emperor's mind. But there was also another reason which counted for much. Napoleon had been drawn into this campaign without really knowing the state of Italian public opinion. He wished Italy to be free from the Alps to the Adriatic, but did not want Italian unity. Rather did he desire the formation of a confederacy wherein France could always make her own predominance felt in the peninsula. Scarcely had he arrived in Italy when he was forced to see that Italian ideals were very different from what he had imagined them to be. Trials had but ripened the virtues of prudence and wisdom in men's minds. In 1859, the people were little likely to repeat the blunders of 1848 or 1849, and there were now no longer discussions over forms of government, but everywhere a unanimous resolve to rally round the liberal monarchy of Savoy. On the first proclamation of the war, the Grand Duke of Tuscany had been compelled to fly from his states, April 27th. Napoleon had imagined that in this province, the ancient stronghold of Italian municipalism, it would be easy to form a new kingdom with a Bonaparte to wear its crown. With this aim in view, the 5th French Army Corps, commanded by Prince Jérôme Napoleon, had debarked at Leghorn, under the pretext of organizing the military forces of central Italy and harassing the Austrians on the extreme left. But the Tuscans soon divined the real intention of the French, and the provisional government in Florence, previously instituted under Bettino Ricasoli, suddenly avowed its intention of uniting Tuscany to Sardinia, whereupon Prince Napoleon, seeing the true attitude of the country, found it advisable to promote the annexation. The duchies of Parma and Modena had also been deserted by their dukes, and the papal legates had to quit Romagna, whose inhabitants now suddenly announced their fusion with Sardinia. Indeed, this impulse for annexation now began to spread, and to the cry of "Victor Emmanuel," the Marches and Umbria revolted against the pontiff. But in these regions the movement was sanguinarily suppressed by the Swiss troops. Napoleon III was displeased to note how all Italian aspirations tended to unity, and thus it was that he had signed the Treaty of Villafranca. Peace was concluded at Zurich in the November following, and there the idea of an Italian confederation was mooted afresh. The fugitive princes ought to have returned to their states, but how was it possible? They certainly could not hope to be recalled by their subjects, for the latter had expelled them. Occupying their kingdoms with troops of their own was out of the question, because they had none. Foreign aid, moreover, was not to be looked for, since Napoleon III had established the principle of non-intervention. Then the people of central Italy showed themselves capable of a bold political coup. Under the leadership of Bettino Ricasoli, dictator in Tuscany, and Luigi Carlo Farini, who held a similar office in Emilia and Romagna, they declared, by means of their assembled deputies, their earnest desire to be incorporated with Sardinia. The new ministry, formed at Turin after Cavour's resignation, had pursued its way timidly, fearing to rouse the suspicion and displeasure of the European powers. But at this momentous and difficult juncture, Cavour again accepted the premiership, January 20, 1860. He immediately gave a bolder impetus to King Victor Emmanuel's policy by sending a note to all the powers in which he asserted it to be now impossible for Sardinia to offer any resistance to the inevitable course of events. Cavour imagined that since Napoleon III had obtained the imperial throne by a plebiscite, he would not deny the validity of such a claim in Italy, and forthwith submitted this idea to the emperor, who was bound to approve of it. But the French nation was discontented, imagining that the blood it had shed for Italy had profited nothing, and was, moreover, very averse to the formation of a powerful kingdom beyond the Alps. Now it was that Cavour determined on a great sacrifice. In the Convention of Plombières, it had been agreed that, in the event of a kingdom of 11 million inhabitants being established from the Alps to the Adriatic, Sardinia would cede Savoy to France. As, however, by the Treaty of Villafranca, Venetia had remained under the Austrian yoke, no more had been said about secession of territory. But by the annexation of central Italy, the number of Victor Emmanuel's subjects was now augmented to 11 millions. In order to induce Napoleon III to approve of such an annexation, Cavour offered him Savoy, but the emperor claimed Nice as well, and the minister was obliged to accede to his demands. On March 24, 1860, Savoy, the cradle of the reigning dynasty, and Nice, Garibaldi's native province, were ceded to France. Garibaldi, deeply wounded in his tenderest feelings, violently abused Cavour in Parliament. But the Chamber, although it respected the hero's emotion, ratified the treaty, which was at this crisis a necessary concession. At the same time, Parma, Modena, Romagna, and Tuscany expressed by universal suffrage their cordial desire for union with Sardinia, and a few days later the fusion of these provinces with the dominions of the House of Savoy was an accomplished fact. On April 2, 1860, at the opening of the new Parliament, Victor Emmanuel could thus sum up the results already obtained by the Nationalist Party. Quote, "In a very short space of time, an invasion repulsed, Lombardy liberated by valiant feats of arms, Central Italy freed by her people's wonderful strength, and today assembled around me here the representatives of the rights and hopes of the nation." End quote. End of section 28. Read by Ingrid Falk, Béziers, France, June 2025.
Section 29 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswax Candle. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Darwin publishes his Origin of Species, A.D. 1859, by Charles Robert Darwin. Whatever may be said of the credit due to other scientists for investigation or discovery in natural selection, the preeminence of Darwin in this field is undisputed. If, of any scientific book, it can be said that its appearance was epoch-making, it is true of Darwin's work on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. Not only did it command the earnest attention of the scientific and literary world, but it awakened the interest of thoughtful persons everywhere. Later research and criticism have modified the effect of his conclusions and led to new results, but the Darwinian theory, or Darwinism, still holds and seems likely long to maintain a central place in the history of modern scientific development. Charles Robert Darwin was born at Shrewsbury, England, February 12, 1809. He was the grandson of Erasmus Darwin, an eminent physician, naturalist and poet, who in 1794 to 1796 published an important work entitled Zoonomia, or the Laws of Organic Life. Charles Darwin was heir to a fortune, and in youth the possession of ample means prevented him from taking any deep interest in studying for a profession, although he did study medicine, and later for the church. But before reaching his majority, he turned to natural history. At Cambridge, he enjoyed an intimacy with the distinguished botanist, Professor John S. Henslow, who quickened the young man's enthusiasm for scientific investigation. In his 23rd year, Darwin went as a naturalist with a government expedition to Patagonia. The voyage, in the Beagle, 1831 to 1836, was continued round the world. Darwin's journals of the expedition served him in his later work, and also furnished much material for popular information. From 1842, when he went to reside at Down in Kent, he devoted himself wholly to a life of scientific research and writing. Since it is not an uncommon error to confound natural selection with evolution, it may be well to point out that, while based on evolution, Darwinism is distinct from it. Evolution is the development of new organisms through heredity, variation and adaptation. Darwinism, or the doctrine of natural selection, as best defined in these pages by Darwin himself, is seen to involve quite different factors from those of evolution as thus restricted. For candour and childlike simplicity, the writings of Darwin are especially noteworthy among the modest utterances of great men, and nowhere are these qualities more strikingly revealed than in the following account of the production of his principal work. From September 1854, I devoted my whole time to arranging my huge pile of notes, to observing and to experimenting in relation to the transmutation of species. During the voyage of the Beagle, I had been deeply impressed by discovering in the Pampaean formation great fossil animals covered with armour like that on the existing armadillos. Secondly, by the manner in which closely allied animals replace one another in proceeding southward over the continent, and thirdly, by the South American character of most of the productions of the Galapagos archipelago, and more especially by the manner in which they differ slightly on each island of the group, none of the islands appearing to be very ancient in a geological sense. It was evident that such facts as these, as well as many others, could be explained only on the supposition that species gradually become modified, and the subject haunted me. But it was equally evident that neither the action of the surrounding conditions, nor the will of the organisms, especially in the case of plants, could account for the innumerable cases in which organisms of every kind are beautifully adapted to their habits of life. For instance, a woodpecker or a tree frog to climb trees, or a seed for dispersal by hooks or plumes. I had always been much struck by such adaptations, and until these could be explained, it seemed to me almost useless to endeavour to prove by indirect evidence that the species have been modified. After my return to England, it appeared to me that by following the example of Lyell in geology, and by collecting all facts which bore in any way on the variation of animals and plants under domestication in nature, some light might perhaps be thrown on the whole subject. My first notebook was opened in July 1837. I worked on true Baconian principles, and without any theory collected facts on a wholesale scale, more especially with respect to domesticated productions, by printed inquiries, by conversation with skilful breeders and gardeners, and by extensive reading. When I see the list of books of all kinds which I read and abstracted, including a whole series of journals and transactions, I am surprised at my industry. I soon perceived that selection was the keystone of man's success in making useful races of animals and plants. But how selection could be applied to organisms living in a state of nature remained for some time a mystery to me. In November 1838, that is, 15 months after I had begun my systematic inquiry, I happened to read for amusement Malthus's Essay on the Principle of Population, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on, from long-continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances favourable variations would tend to be preserved, and unfavourable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. Here, then, I had at last got a theory by which to work. But I was so anxious to avoid prejudice that I determined not for some time to write even the briefest sketch of it. In June 1842, I first allowed myself the satisfaction of writing a very brief abstract of my theory in pencil in 35 pages. This was enlarged during the summer of 1844 into one of 230 pages, which I had fairly copied out and still possess. But at that time I overlooked one problem of great importance, and it is astonishing to me, except on the principle of Columbus and his egg, how I could have overlooked it, and its solution. This problem is the tendency in organic beings descended from the same stock to diverge in character as they become modified. That they have diverged greatly is obvious from the manner in which species of all kinds can be classed under genera, genera under families, families under suborders, and so on. And I can remember the very spot on the road, while riding in my carriage, that, to my joy, the solution occurred to me. And this was long after I had come to Down. The solution, as I believe, is that the modified offspring of all dominant and increasing forms tend to become adapted to many and highly diversified places in the economy of nature. Early in 1856, Lyell advised me to write out my views fully, and I began at once to do so on a scale 3 or 4 times as extensive as that which afterward followed in my Origin of Species. Yet it was only an abstract of the materials which I had collected, and I got through about half the work on this scale. But my plans were overthrown, for early in the summer of 1858, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was then in the Malay archipelago, sent me an essay on the tendency of varieties to depart indefinitely from the original type, and this essay contained exactly the same theory as mine, Mr. Wallace expressed the wish that if I thought well of his essay, I should send it to Lyell for perusal. The circumstances under which I consented, at the request of Lyell and Hooker, to allow an abstract from my manuscript, together with a letter to Asa Gray, dated September the 5th, 1857, to be published at the same time with Wallace's essay, are given in the Journal of the Proceedings of the Linnean Society, 1858. I was at first very unwilling to consent, as I thought Mr. Wallace might consider my doing so unjustifiable, for I did not then know how generous and noble was his disposition. Neither the extract from my manuscript nor the letter to Gray had been intended for publication, and they were badly written. Mr. Wallace's essay, on the other hand, was admirably expressed and quite clear. Nevertheless, our joint productions excited very little attention, and the only published notice of them which I can remember was by Professor Horne of Dublin, whose verdict was that all that was new in them was false, and what was true was old. This shows how necessary it is that any new view should be explained at considerable length in order to arouse public attention. In September 1858, I set to work by the strong advice of Lyell and Hooker to prepare a volume on the transmutation of species, but was often interrupted by ill health and short visits to Dr. Lane's delightful hydropathic establishment at Moor Park. I abstracted the manuscript begun on a much larger scale in 1856, and completed the volume on the same reduced scale. It cost me 13 months and 10 days' hard labour. It was published under the title of The Origin of Species in November 1859. Though considerably added to and corrected in the later editions, it has remained substantially the same book. It is no doubt the chief work of my life. It was from the first highly successful. The first small edition of 1,250 copies was sold on the day of publication, and a second edition of 3,000 copies soon afterward. 16,000 copies have now, 1876, been sold in England, and considering how stiff a book it is, this is a large number. It has been translated into almost every European language, even into such languages as Spanish, Bohemian, Polish, and Russian. It has also, according to Miss Bird, been translated into Japanese, and is much studied in that country. Even an essay on it has appeared in Hebrew, showing that the theory is contained in the Old Testament. The reviews were very numerous. For some time I collected all that appeared on The Origin and on my related books, and these amount, excluding newspaper reviews, to 265. But after a time I gave up the attempt in despair. Many separate essays and books on the subject have appeared, and in Germany a catalogue or bibliography on Darwinismus has appeared every year or two. The success of The Origin may, I think, be attributed in large part to my having long before written 2 condensed sketches, and to my having finally abstracted a much larger manuscript, which was itself an abstract. By this means I was enabled to select the more striking facts and conclusions. I had also, during many years, followed a golden rule, namely, whenever a published fact, a new observation or thought, came across me which was opposed to my general results, to make a memorandum of it without fail and at once. For I had found by experience that such facts and thoughts were far more apt to escape from the memory than favourable ones. Owing to this habit, very few objections were raised against my views which I had not at least noticed and attempted to answer. It has sometimes been said that the success of The Origin proved that the subject was in the air, or that men's minds were prepared for it. I do not think that this is strictly true, for I occasionally sounded not a few naturalists, and never happened to come across a single one who seemed to doubt about the permanence of species. Even Lyell and Hooker, though they would listen with interest to me, never seemed to agree. I tried once or twice to explain to able men what I meant by natural selection, but signally failed. What I believe was strictly true is that innumerable well-observed facts were stored in the minds of naturalists, ready to take their proper places as soon as any theory that would receive them was sufficiently explained. Another element in the success of the book was its moderate size, and this I owe to the appearance of Mr. Wallace's essay. Had I published on the scale on which I began to write in 1856, the book would have been 4 or 5 times as large as the origin, and very few would have had the patience to read it. I gained much by my delay in publishing from about 1839, when the theory was clearly conceived, to 1859, and I lost nothing by it, for I cared very little whether men attributed more originality to me or to Wallace, and his essay no doubt aided in the reception of the theory. I was forestalled in only one important point, which my vanity has always made me regret, namely the explanation by means of the glacial period of the presence of the same species of plants and of some few animals on distant mountain summits and in the Arctic regions. This view pleased me so much that I wrote it out in extenso, and I believe that it was read by Hooker some years before Edward Forbes published his celebrated memoir on the subject. In the very few points in which we differed, I still think that I was in the right. I've never, of course, alluded in print to my having independently worked out this view. Hardly any point gave me so much satisfaction when I was at work on the origin as the explanation of the wide difference in many classes between the embryo and the adult animal, and of the close resemblance of the embryos within the same class. No notice of this point was taken, as far as I remember, in the early reviews of the origin, and I recollect expressing my surprise on this head in a letter to Asa Gray. Within late years, several reviewers have given the whole credit to Fritz Müller and Heckel, who undoubtedly have worked it out much more fully, and in some respects more correctly than I did. I had materials for a whole chapter on the subject, and I ought to have made the discussion longer, for it is clear that I failed to impress my readers, and he who succeeds in doing so deserves, in my opinion, all the credit. This leads me to remark that I have almost without exception been treated honestly by my reviewers, passing over those without scientific knowledge as not worthy of notice. My views have often been grossly misrepresented, bitterly opposed, and ridiculed, but this has been generally done, as I believe, in good faith. On the whole, I do not doubt that my works have been repeatedly and greatly overpraised. I rejoice that I have avoided controversies, and this I owe to Lyell, who many years ago, in reference to my geological works, strongly advised me never to get entangled in a controversy, as it really did any good and caused a miserable loss of time and temper. Whenever I have found out that I have blundered, or that my work has been imperfect, and when I have been contemptuously criticised, and even when I have been overpraised that I have felt mortified, it has been my greatest comfort to say hundreds of times to myself that I have worked as hard and as well as I could, and no man can do more than this. I remember when, in Good Success Bay in Terra del Fuego, thinking, and I believe that I wrote home to that effect, that I could not employ my life better than in adding a little to natural science. This I have done to the best of my abilities, and critics may say what they like, but they cannot destroy this conviction. During the last 2 months of 1859, I was fully occupied in preparing a second edition of the Origin, and by an enormous correspondence. On January the 1st, 1860, I began arranging my notes for my work on the variation of animals and plants under domestication, but it was not published until the beginning of 1868, the delay having been caused partly by frequent periods of illness, one of which lasted 7 months, and partly by being tempted to publish on other subjects which had at the time interested me more. My Descent of Man was published in February 1871. As soon as I had become, in the year 1837 or 1838, convinced that species were mutable productions, I could not avoid the belief that man must come under the same law. Accordingly, I collected notes on the subject for my own satisfaction, but not for a long time with any intention of publishing. Although in the Origin of Species, the derivation of any particular species is never discussed, yet I thought it best, in order that no honourable man should accuse me of concealing my views, to add that by the work light would be thrown on the origin of man and his history. It would have been useless and injurious to the success of the book to parade, without giving any evidence, my conviction with respect to his origin. But when I found that many naturalists fully accepted the doctrine of the evolution of species, it seemed to me advisable to work up such notes as I possessed, and to publish a special treatise on the origin of man. I was the more glad to do so as it gave me an opportunity of fully discussing sexual selection, a subject which has always greatly interested me. This subject, and that of the variation of our domestic productions, together with the causes and laws of variation, inheritance, and the intercrossing of plants, are the sole subjects which I have been able to write about in full, so as to use all the materials which I have collected. The Descent of Man took me 3 years to write, but then, as usual, some of this time was lost by ill health, and some was consumed by preparing new editions and other minor works. A second and largely corrected edition of The Descent appeared in 1874. End of section 29.
Section 30 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Betty B. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. The Kingdom of Italy, established A.D. 1860 by Giuseppi Garibaldi. After the suppression of the Italian Revolution by Austria in 1849 and the restoration of Austrian power in Italy, Charles Albert, King of Sardinia, who had headed the movement for Italian independence and had been defeated, abdicated in favor of his son, Victor Emmanuel. The new king, as Victor Emmanuel II, succeeded to the throne March 23, 1849, the day of his father's defeat at Novara. He was a liberal sovereign and zealous for the cause of his country. With the aid of his great minister, Count Cavour, he proceeded with the work of securing the unity and freedom of Italy. In 1859, Sardinia and France, in alliance, defeated Austria. In this war were made the substantial beginnings from which a new Italian nationality was to be realized. Italian unity was not the object of Napoleon III in his alliance with Italy against Austria, but he did much to advance its prospects. He even promised the complete liberation of Italy, but this promise he failed to fulfill, to the great disappointment of Italian statesmen. Napoleon wished to see an Italian confederation with the Pope at its head, but this plan was rejected. Sicily and Naples in southern Italy were still governed by a Bourbon prince. It was necessary to get rid of him, but Victor Emmanuel did not desire another war. The matter was decided through the action of Garibaldi, whose first step toward ending the last remnant of Bourbon rule in Italy was a bold descent upon Sicily. This movement he made against the wishes of Cavour and in furtherance of the plans of Young Italy. His own account of his landing at Marsala and of the Battle of Calatafimi, regarded by him as one of the most memorable in his military experience, is as characteristic of Garibaldi the man and writer as were his exploits characteristic of Garibaldi the soldier. The events that quickly followed Garibaldi's descent upon Sicily marked the beginning of a new era in Italian history. After his victory at Calatafimi, Garibaldi moved toward Palermo, the capital. On May 24th, the Bourbon troops of Francis II, King of the Two Sicilies, marched out of the city to meet him. By shrewd tactics, Garibaldi outmaneuvered them. On the 26th, he marched on Palermo with about 3,000 men and attacked the city on the 27th. The battle was a confused struggle of military and civilians. Many citizens of Palermo, armed with daggers, knives, spits, and iron instruments of any kind, taking part, in favor of Garibaldi, in the street fighting that accompanied the more regular conflict. The city fell through revolt of the people and defection of the king's troops, rather than by the assaults of Garibaldi's men. 20,000 soldiers of despotism capitulating before a handful of citizens, self-devoted in the cause of freedom. By June 6th, Garibaldi had complete possession of Palermo. Other successes in his famous campaign of liberation followed rapidly, and his final triumph was achieved in the later events so eloquently described by Probyn, the historian of Italy's progress through her most important transformations in the 19th century. Giuseppi Garibaldi. As we approached the western coast of Sicily, we began to discover sailing vessels and steamers. On the roadstead of Marsala, 2 men of war were anchored, which turned out to be English. Having decided on landing at Marsala, we approached that port and reached it about noon. On entering the harbor, we found it full of merchant vessels of different nations. Fortune had indeed favored us, and so guided our expedition that we could not have arrived at a more propitious moment. The Bourbon cruisers had left the harbor of Marsala that morning, sailing eastward while we were arriving from the west. Indeed, they were still in sight toward Cape San Marco as we entered, so that by the time they came within cannon shot, we had already landed all the men out of the Piemonte and were beginning to debark those on board the Lombardo. The presence of the 2 English men of war in some degree influenced the determination of the Bourbon commanders, who were naturally impatient to open fire on us, and this circumstance gave us time to get our whole force on shore. The noble English flag once more helped to prevent bloodshed, and I, the Benjamin of these lords of the ocean, was for the 100th time protected by them. The assertion, however, made by our enemies that the English had directly favored and assisted our landing at Marsala was inaccurate. The British colors, flying from the 2 men of war and the English consulate, made the Bourbon mercenaries hesitate, and I might even say impressed them with a sense of shame at pouring the fire of their imposing batteries into a handful of men armed only with the kind of muskets usually supplied by the government to Italian volunteers. Notwithstanding this, 3/4 of the volunteers were still on the quay when the Bourbons began firing on them with shells and grape shot, happily without injury to anyone. The Piemonte, abandoned by us, was carried off by the enemy, who left the Lombardo, which had grounded on a sandbank. The population of Marsala, thunderstruck at this unexpected event, received us pretty well, all things considered. The common people, indeed, were delighted. The magnates welcomed us under protest. I thought all this very natural. Those who are accustomed to calculate everything at so much per cent are not likely to be reassured by the sight of a few desperadoes, who wish to ameliorate a corrupt society by eradicating from it the cancer of privilege and falsehood, especially when these desperadoes, few as they are, and with neither 300-pounders nor ironclads, fling themselves against a power believed to be gigantic, like that of the Bourbon. Men of high rank, that is, the privileged class, before risking anything in an enterprise, wish to assure themselves which way the wind of fortune blows, and where the large battalions are, and then the victorious force may be certain of finding them compliant, cordial, and even enthusiastic, if need be. Is this not the history of human selfishness in every country? The poor people, on the other hand, welcomed us with applause and with unmistakable tokens of affection. They thought of nothing but the sacredness of the sacrifice, the difficult and noble task undertaken by that handful of gallant young fellows who had come from such a distance to the succor of their brethren. We passed the remainder of the day and the following night at Marsala, where I began to profit by the services of Crispy, an honest and capable Sicilian, who was of the greatest use to me in government business, and in making all necessary arrangements which my want of local knowledge prevented my doing myself. A dictatorship was spoken of, and I accepted it without hesitation, having always believed in the plank of safety in urgent cases, amid the breakers in which nations often find themselves. On the morning of the 12th, the 1,000 left for Salemi, but the distance being too great for one étape, we stopped at the farm of Mistretta, where we passed the night. We did not find the proprietor at home, but a young man, his brother, did the honors with kindly and liberal hospitality. At Mistretta we formed a new company under Grislotti. On the 13th we marched to Salemi, where we were well received by the people, and were joined by the companies of Sant'Anna di Alcamo and some other volunteers of the island. On the 14th we occupied Vita, or San Vito, and on the 15th came in sight of the enemy, who, occupying Calatafimi, and knowing of our approach in that direction, had spread out the great part of their forces on the heights called Il Pianto dei Romani. The dawn of May 15th found us in good order on the heights of Vita, and a little later the enemy, whom I knew to be at Calatafimi, left the city in column, marching toward us. The hills of Vita are confronted by the heights of the Pianto dei Romani, where the enemy deployed his columns. On the Calatafimi side, these heights have a gentle slope, easily ascended by the enemy, who covered all the highest points, while on the Vita side they are steep and precipitous. Occupying the opposite and southern heights, I had been able to perceive exactly all the positions held by the Bourbonists, while the latter could scarcely see the line of sharpshooters formed by the Genoese carbineers under Mosto, who covered our front, all the other companies being drawn up on echelon behind them. Our scanty artillery was stationed on our left, on the high road, under Orsini, who succeeded, in spite of the poverty of his resources, in making a few good shots. In this way, both we and the enemy occupied strong positions, fronting each other, and separated by a wide space of undulating ground, broken by a few farmsteadings. Our advantage, therefore, clearly lay in awaiting the enemy in our own position. The Bourbon forces, to the number of about 2,000, with some cannon, discovering a few of our men without distinguishing uniform, and mingled with peasants, boldly advanced a few lines of bersaglieri with sufficient support and 2 guns. Arrived within firing distance, they opened with carbines and cannon while advancing on us. The order given to the 1,000 was to wait without firing for the enemy to come up, though the gallant Ligurians already had 1 man killed and several wounded. The blare of the bugles, sounding an American reveille, brought the enemy to a halt as if by magic. They understood that it was not the Picciotti alone they had to deal with, and their lines, with the artillery, gave the signal for a retrograde movement. This was the first time that the soldiers of despotism had quailed before the filibusters, for such was the title with which our enemies honored us. The 1,000 then sounded a charge, the Genoese carbineers in the van, followed by a chosen band of youths impatient to come to close quarters. The intention of the charge was to put to flight the enemy's vanguard and get possession of the 2 guns, a maneuver that was executed with a spirit worthy of the champions of Italian liberty. But I had no intention of a front attack on a formidable position occupied by a strong force of Bourbon troops. But who could stop those fiery and impetuous volunteers in their rush on the foe? In vain the trumpets sounded a halt. Our men did not hear, or imitated Nelson's conduct at the Battle of Copenhagen. They turned a deaf ear to the order to halt sounded by the trumpets, and with their bayonets drove the enemy's van back on their main body. There was not a moment to be lost, or that gallant handful would have perished. Immediately a general charge was sounded, and the entire corps of the 1,000, accompanied by some courageous Sicilians and Calabrese, marched at a quick pace to the rescue. The enemy had abandoned the plain, but falling back on the heights where their reserve was, held firm and defended their position with a dogged valor worthy of a better cause. The most dangerous part of the ground we had to cross was the level valley separating us from the enemy, where we had to face a storm of cannon and musket balls which wounded a good many of our men. Arrived at the foot of Monte Romano, we were almost sheltered from attack, and at this point the 1,000, somewhat diminished in number, closed up to the vanguard. The situation was supreme. We were bound to win. In this determination, we began to ascend the first ledge of the mountains, under a hail of bullets. I do not remember how many, but there were certainly several terraces to be gained before reaching the crest of the heights, and every time we climbed from one terrace to the next, during which operation we were totally unprotected, we were under a tremendous fire. The orders given to our men to fire, but few shots were well adapted to the wretched weapons presented to us by the Sardinian government, which nearly always missed fire. On this occasion, too, Great service was rendered by the gallant Genoese, who, being excellent shots and armed with good carbines, sustained the honor of our cause. This ought to be an encouragement to all young Italians to exercise themselves in the use of arms, in the conviction that valor alone is not enough on modern battlefields. Great dexterity in the use of weapons is also necessary. Calatafimi, the survivor of 100 battles. If in my last moments my friends see me smile once more with pride, it will be at the recollection of that fight, for I remember none more glorious. The 1,000, attired just as at home, worthy representatives of their people, attacked, with heroic coolness, fighting their way from one formidable position to another, the soldiers of tyranny, brilliant in gaudily trimmed uniforms, gold lace and epaulets, and completely routed them. How can I forget that knot of youths who, fearing to see me wounded, surrounded me, pressing themselves closely together and sheltering me with their bodies? If, while I write, I am deeply touched at the recollection, I have good reason. It is not my duty, at least, to remind Italy of those brave sons of hers who fell there? Montanari, Sciaffino, Sertorio, Nullo, Vigo, Tuceri, Taddai, and many more whose names I grieve to say I cannot remember. As I have already said, the southern slope of Monte Romano, which we had to ascend, was formed of those ledges or narrow terraces used by the cultivators of the soil in mountainous countries. We made all possible haste to reach the bank of each terrace, driving the enemy before us and then halting under cover of the bank to take breath and prepare for the attack. Proceeding thus, we gained one ledge after another, till we reached the top, where the Bourbon troops made a last effort, defending their position with great intrepidity, many of their chasseurs, who had come to the end of their ammunition, even throwing down stones on us. At last we gave the final charge. The bravest of the 1,000 massed together under the last bank, after taking breath and measuring with their eye the space yet to be traversed, before crossing swords with the enemy, rushed on like lions, confident of victory and trusting in their sacred cause. The Bourbon force could not resist the terrible onset of men fighting for freedom. They fled, and never stopped till they reached the town of Calatafimi, several miles from the battlefield. We ceased our pursuit a short distance from the entrance to the town, which is very strongly situated. If one gives battle, one ought to be sure of victory. This axiom is very true under all circumstances, but especially at the beginning of a campaign. The victory of Calatafimi, though of slight importance as regards acquisitions, for we took only one cannon, a few rifles, and a few prisoners, had an immeasurable moral result in encouraging the population and demoralizing the hostile army. The handful of filibusters, without gold lace or epaulets, who were spoken of with such solemn contempt, had routed several thousand of the Bourbon's best troops, artillery and all, commanded by one of those generals who, like Lucullus, are ready to spend the revenue of a province on one night's supper. One corps of citizens, not to say filibusters, animated by love of their country, can therefore gain a victory unaided by all this needless splendor. The first important result was the enemy's retreat from Calatafimi, which town we occupied on the following morning, May 16, 1860. The second result, and one abundantly noteworthy, was the attack made by the population of Partenicio, Borghetto, Montelepre, and other places on the retreating army. In every place volunteer companies were formed, which speedily joined us, and the enthusiasm in the surrounding villages reached its height. The disbanded troops of the enemy did not stop till they reached Palermo, where they brought terror to the Bourbon party and confidence to the patriots. Our wounded and those of the enemy were brought into Vita and Calatafimi. Among ours were some men who could ill be spared. Montanari, my comrade at Rome and in Lombardy, was dangerously wounded and died a few days later. He was one of those whom doctrinaires call demagogues, because they are impatient of servitude, love their country, and refuse to bow the knee to the caprices and vices of the great. Montanari was a Modenese. Sciaffino, a young Ligurian from Camoli, who had also served in the Cacciatori delle Alpi and in the Guides, was among the first to fall on the field, bereaving Italy of one of her bravest soldiers. He worked hard on the night of our start from Genoa, and greatly assisted Bixio in that delicate undertaking. D'Amici, also of the Cacciatori and Guides, was another who fell at the beginning of the battle. Not a few of the chosen band of the 1,000 fell at Calatafimi as our Roman forefathers fell, rushing on the enemy with cold steel, cut down in front without a complaint, without a cry, except that of "Viva l'Italia!" I may have seen battles more desperate and more obstinately contested, but in none have I seen finer soldiers than my citizen filibusters of Calatafimi. The victory of Calatafimi was indisputably the decisive battle in the brilliant campaign of 1860. It was absolutely necessary to begin the expedition with some striking engagement such as this, which so demoralized the enemy that their fervent Southern imaginations even exaggerated the valor of the 1,000. There were some among them who declared they had seen the bullets of their carbines rebound from the breasts of the soldiers of liberty as if from a plate of bronze. Far more men were killed and wounded at Palermo, Milazzo, and the Volturno, but still I believe Calatafimi to have been the decisive battle. After a fight like that, our men knew they were bound to win, and the gallant Sicilians, whose courage had been previously shaken by the imposing numbers and superior equipment of the Bourbon force, were encouraged. When a battle begins with such prestige, with omens drawn from such a precedent, victory is sure. End of section 30.
Section 31 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michael Fazio. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. The Kingdom of Italy Established, A.D. 1860, by John Webb Probyn. On June 27, 1860, about 3 weeks after Garibaldi had taken possession of Palermo, Francis II solemnly announced his intention to give a constitution to the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, adopt the Italian flag, and ally himself with Sardinia. These promises only provoked the cry of "too late." They did but recall how often the Neapolitan Bourbons had promised in the hour of danger, and proved faithless to every promise when the danger was past. Victor Emmanuel and his government were now both unable and unwilling to agree to any such terms with the sovereign who had rejected similar offers at the beginning of his reign when such a settlement was possible. Every friend of freedom felt that the time had gone by for any common action between the houses of Savoy and Bourbon. Each had taken its own line of action, and each was now to abide by the result. Garibaldi had overthrown the Neapolitan rule in Sicily and raised the cry of "Italy and Victor Emmanuel," which found a hearty response. Having been so successful, he now determined, despite the warnings of friendly advisers and the hostility of enemies, to carry his forces from Sicily to the mainland, and take possession of Naples itself. He was at the head of about 20,000 men, and under the command of Generals Medici, Bixio, Cosenz, and Turr. He had also the prestige of victory mingled with a kind of legendary fame which continually increased. These were formidable aids to further success, especially when brought to bear on the fervid feelings and imagination of the southern people. Francis of Naples still possessed an army of 80,000 men, of which he dispatched more than 20,000 to arrest, if possible, the progress of his formidable opponent. Victor Emmanuel sought to dissuade Garibaldi from an enterprise so full of danger as that of marching upon Naples against the wishes of the united cabinets of continental Europe. The king desired that matters should proceed by negotiation, the basis of which should be that Neapolitans and Sicilians should be allowed to decide their future destinies for themselves. Garibaldi, who loved and trusted the honest king, replied that the actual state of Italy compelled him to disobey his majesty. "When," said the noble-hearted patriot, "I shall have delivered the populations from the yoke that weighs them down, I will throw my sword at your feet, and will then obey you for the rest of my life." In truth, Italians of all ranks were now so roused that neither Victor Emmanuel, Cavour, nor even Garibaldi himself could have stayed the movement. The overpowering strength of foreign armies could alone have put it down. Circumstances, however, happily prevented so gross an abuse of mere force. For once Italians were allowed to do as they wished in their own country, instead of being compelled by foreign powers to do as those powers commanded. Many things concurred to bring about this result. The French emperor had just received Savoy and Nice. He had been spending the blood and treasure of France and giving the first blow to the old despotisms of Italy. How could he now fly in the face of his own principle of the national will in order to save the worst of those despotisms? He could not declare that Sicilians and Neapolitans should not dare to have the opportunity of doing what he had at last permitted in central Italy and profited by in Nice and Savoy. To have allowed Austria to do so would be to stultify himself in the eyes of Europe, to enrage Italians, and to lead France to ask what was the use of calling on her to make sacrifices for the overthrow of Austrian domination in the peninsula if within a few months that domination was to be in a large measure restored. Austria, too, had her own difficulties to encounter, and they were both numerous and complicated. Her military and priestly despotism had suffered defeat. Her people disliked its rule and desired freer institutions. Her finances were terribly disordered. The emperor was beginning to see the necessity of a change of system, a change by no means easy to effect, for the Hungarians were demanding the restoration of their ancient constitutional rights. Russia and Prussia contented themselves with protests which had, it may be, some diplomatic value, but were wholly without practical effect. England was favorable to the extension of Italian liberties, and France was her ally in Syria and in China. So it was that Garibaldi, having only to encounter the naval and military forces of Francis II, crossed the Straits of Messina, landed in Calabria, and marched on Reggio. On August 21st, the town was occupied, and the citadel, with its commander and soldiers, capitulated. Another victory was gained on the 23rd, dispersing the forces of the Neapolitan generals Melendez and Briganti. Some of their soldiers joined Garibaldi. The rest returned to their homes and increased both his real and his legendary fame by their account of his victories. The insurrection against the Bourbon dynasty was now rapidly spreading. At Cosenza in Calabria and at Potenza in the Basilicata, provisional governments were proclaimed and were hailing with delight the progress of Garibaldi. The forces of Francis were disappearing from those provinces and leaving the road to Naples unprotected. The fleet was as little to be counted on as the army. In Naples itself, all was confusion and contradiction in the government. None of its members trusted the others or believed in the duration of the Bourbon dynasty. Years of corruption, tyranny, falsehood, and cruelty had undermined the whole system, and it fell before the storm as if by magic. Francis II determined to leave his capital. When he ordered the troops, which still remained faithful to him, to retreat upon Capua and Gaeta, 2/3 of the staff sent in their resignations, as did many of the officers of the Neapolitan fleet. The king addressed a protest to the foreign powers, in which he declared he only quitted his capital to save it from the horrors of a siege. He issued a proclamation to his people in which he expressed his wishes for their happiness, and declared that when restored to his throne it would be all that more splendid from the institutions he had now irrevocably given. On September 6, 1860, he left the capital on board a steamer accompanied by 2 Spanish frigates, and was taken to Gaeta. On September 7th, Garibaldi entered Naples at midday in an open carriage, accompanied by some of his staff. For long hours he received a welcome such as has seldom, if ever, been given to any other man. Again and again he had to appear on the balcony of the Palazzo d'Angri, where he had taken up his quarters, to receive the applause of the multitude. At 8 o'clock that evening it was at length announced that, worn out with fatigue and emotion, he had retired to rest. A sudden quiet fell upon the vast crowds, and repeating to one another, "Our Father sleeps," they dispersed to their homes, their right hands raised above their heads, with the first finger alone extended, a sign expressive of the cry reiterated again and again that day, "Italia una," one Italy. On September 10th, Garibaldi issued a proclamation to his soldiers, headed, quote, Italy and Victor Emmanuel, unquote. In it, the general called upon them to aid him in carrying to a successful termination the work so well begun. Nor did he hesitate to declare that Rome must be Italian, and the line of the Alps the frontier of Italy. He addressed another proclamation to the people in which he especially called on them to be united. Quote, The first need of Italy is concord in order to realize the union of the great Italian family. Today, Providence has given us this concord, since all the provinces are unanimous and labor with magnanimous zeal of the national reconstruction. As to unity, Providence has further given us Victor Emmanuel, a model sovereign who will inculcate in his descendants the duties which they should fulfill for the happiness of a people who have chosen him as their chief with enthusiastic homage. Unquote. The proclamation went on to speak with kindly warmth of those Italian priests who had sided with the national cause, and declared that such conduct was a sure means of gaining respect for their mission and work. Repeating again the demand for concord, the concluding words justly protested against all foreign interference. Quote, Finally, be it known, we respect the houses of others, but we insist upon being masters in our own, whether it please or displeases the rulers of the earth. Unquote. Garibaldi united the Neapolitan to the Sardinian fleet, so forming an Italian naval force. He appointed a ministry comprising Liborio Romano, who had served under Francis II, Scialoia, Cosenz, and Pisanelli. He then proceeded to promulgate the Sardinian constitution throughout the Neapolitan provinces. But the Bourbon forces were still in possession of Capua and Gaeta. It became necessary, therefore, to undertake military operations against them. Meanwhile, the agitation in the papal provinces was increasing. The Pope's government had refused to modify its policy or agree to any reduction of its territory. It accepted the protection of France and Rome and its immediate neighborhood, but declined further aid, as it was raising forces of its own under a French general, Lamoriciere. These soldiers were men of various European nationalities belonging to that Roman Catholic party which was determined to maintain intact the temporal rule of the Pope as against the wishes of the vast majority of Italians, themselves Roman Catholics, who desired to substitute for that rule the constitutional sovereignty of King Victor Emmanuel. The Italians were willing enough to remain under the spiritual headship of the Roman pontiff, but they would not have a temporal power upheld by foreign soldiers. The moment was, like many others, a very critical one in the history of Italy. Garibaldi was victorious in Naples. The papal forces, composed chiefly of Germans and French, under Lamoriciere, were holding the inhabitants of Umbria and the Marches, who were longing to join the national movement. Indeed, some of the most influential men of those provinces, among others Marquis Filippo Gualterio of Orvieto, had already come to Turin to obtain the intervention of its government and the protection from the papal troops, whose foreign extraction rendered them odious to the people. On September 7th, Count della Minerva was sent to Rome to demand, on the part of Victor Emmanuel, the disbandment of the foreign troops which the papal government had got together under the command of General Lamoriciere. The demand was refused. This refusal the papal government was quite competent to give, but whether its policy in upholding its temporal power by the aid of foreign mercenaries was wise or not was another matter. It was hardly to be expected that Italians, any more than Frenchmen, Germans, or English, would endure such a state of things if they could prevent it. The government of Turin now ordered its troops to enter the papal provinces of Umbria and the Marches. On September 11th, General Fanti crossed the frontier, easily took possession of Perugia with the aid of the inhabitants, and obliged Colonel Schmidt, the papal commander, to capitulate. The general advanced with equal success against Spoleto, and in a few days was master of all the upper valley of the Tiber. At the same time, General Cialdini, operating on the eastern side of the Apennines, marched rapidly to meet General Lamoriciere's forces, which he encountered and defeated completely at Castelfidardo, compelling the French general to fly to Ancona, which he entered in company with only a few horsemen who had escaped with him from the rout of the papal army. The Italian fleet was off Ancona, before which General Cialdini's troops now appeared, thus completely preventing the escape of Lamorissere, who was obliged to surrender. In less than 3 weeks the campaign was over. The Sardinian troops, having thus occupied Umbria and the Marches, proceeded to cross into the Neapolitan provinces and march upon Capua and Gaeta. Austria, Prussia, and Russia protested against the course thus pursued by the government of Victor Emmanuel. The Pope excommunicated all who had participated in the invasion of his territory. Francis II protested with no less earnestness. The Emperor of the French withdrew his minister from Turin and blamed the proceedings of Victor Emmanuel's government. But in other respects, Napoleon remained a passive spectator of all that occurred, and maintained the principle of non-intervention, at least as regarded Umbria and the Marches, Sicily and Naples, excepting at Gaeta, where his fleet prevented for a time any attack being made against that fortress from the sea. He also raised the number of his troops in Rome and the province in which it is situated, called the Patrimony of St. Peter, to 22,000 men. This was now all the territory left to the temporal power of the Pope. Napoleon determined to preserve that much to the Roman See, defending it from the attacks of Garibaldi and forbidding its annexation to the Kingdom of Italy. The English government, however, decidedly vindicated the course taken under the circumstances by Victor Emmanuel and his advisers. Lord Russell, who was Secretary of Foreign Affairs under Lord Palmerston, wrote, on October 27, 1860, an admirable dispatch to Sir James Hudson, the English minister at Turin, who was allowed to give a copy of it to Count Cavour. In that dispatch, Lord Russell gives good reasons for dissenting from the views expressed by the governments of Austria, Prussia, Russia, and France. He justifies the action of the government of Turin, admits that Italians themselves are the best judge of their own interests, shows how in times past they vainly attempted regularly and temperately to reform their governments, says such attempts were put down by foreign powers, and concludes by declaring that, quote, Her Majesty's government will turn their eyes rather to the gratifying prospect of a people building up the edifice of their liberties and consolidating the work of their independence amid the sympathies and good wishes of Europe. Unquote. It is gratifying to remember that at this very critical juncture in the cause of Italian unity and independence, the English government gave its very cordial support to that cause, and ably defended the course pursued by King Victor Emmanuel, his ministers, and his people. The cause of Italian unity and independence had indeed made prodigious strides, due not only to the marvelous victories of Garibaldi, which had brought him in 4 months from Marsala to Naples, but also to the skillful campaigns of Generals Fanti and Cialdini in Umbria and the Marches. Cavour now followed up these successes by advising a course calculated to give them consistency and endurance. He counseled the immediate assembling of the Parliament, the acceptance by Victor Emmanuel of the sovereignty of the Papal, Neapolitan, and Sicilian provinces, if such were the will of their inhabitants, and the departure of the king from Turin to take the command of his troops now advancing towards Capua. Victor Emmanuel entirely agreed with his minister's advice. On October 2, 1860, Cavour asked Parliament for full powers to annex all the new provinces of central and southern Italy if they desired it. He contended that the events which had taken place were due to the initiative of the people, the noble audacity of General Garibaldi, and the constitutional rule of Victor Emmanuel, united to his devotion to the cause of Italian freedom. Even those deputies who represented the views of the extreme left, some of those members avowed a preference for republicanism, in theory at any rate, supported the government. One of them, Signor Bertani, declared he would not now raise any point of difference, and frankly acknowledged that in reality all Italians wished the same thing. Quote, Italy won and free under Victor Emmanuel. Unquote. Cavour further satisfied the chamber by saying that Rome and Venice must in the end be united to the mother country, though the questions involved in such union must, out of deference to Europe and France, be postponed for the present. A vote of 290 against 6 confirmed the policy of the government and gave full expression to the wishes of the country. Garibaldi had in the meantime pushed on his forces from Naples toward Capua and the line of the river Volturno. On September 19th, his troops took Chiasso, in which, however, they were dislodged on the 23rd of the month. After this success, Francis II determined to take the offensive and attack in force the Garibaldian lines with the object of driving them back to Naples or cutting them off from that city. This attempt was well planned and conducted on October 1st, 1860. The struggle was hotly maintained on both sides throughout the day. Some companies of bersaglieri arrived from Naples and united in resisting the attacks of the Bourbon troops, who were in the end repelled and compelled to retire. But though beaten, they had fought well and still held the fortresses of Gaeta and Capua, in which they retreated. The army of Victor Emmanuel, however, led by the king in person, was now rapidly advancing, easily overcoming whatever resistance the Bourbon troops were able to offer. Francis II, unable to prevent the junction of the king's forces with those of Garibaldi, withdrew with the bulk of his soldiers to Gaeta, leaving 4,000 men in Capua, who were soon obliged to capitulate. On October 26th, Victor Emmanuel and Garibaldi met near the little town of Teano. They greeted each other with great cordiality, for though Garibaldi had little faith in ministers or diplomatists, and could not forgive their cession of Nice to France, he felt the utmost confidence in the king himself. Victor Emmanuel, on his part, had the greatest regard for the heroic patriot who had ever been so devoted to his country's cause, and whose marvelous exploits had now given freedom to Sicily and Naples. As they grasped each other's hands, Garibaldi cried, "Behold the King of Italy! Long live the King!" The soldiers of both leaders shouted, "Long live Victor Emmanuel, King of Italy!" On November 7th, the king entered Naples with Garibaldi at his side. The reception was enthusiastic in the extreme. It reached its culminating point as Victor Emmanuel entered the royal palace. Long had it been the abode of those who hated and betrayed both constitutional liberty and national freedom. Now it was taken possession of by one who had risked life and crown in their cause. The king issued a proclamation in which he called to mind the increased responsibilities which fell henceforth upon himself and his people alike. Nor did he fail to remind them of the necessity for union and abnegation. Quote, "All parties must bow before the majesty of Italy which God has raised up. We must establish a government which gives guarantees of liberty to the people and of severe probity to the public at large." Unquote. In the succeeding days, His Majesty received the deputations of the newly acquired provinces of Umbria, the Marches, Naples, and Sicily, which came to present to him officially the result of the plebiscite by which the inhabitants of those provinces declared their wish to be united to the rest of the king's dominions and so form a single kingdom of Italy. Many other receptions there were of societies belonging to several ranks and classes of men. Particularly impressive was the welcome given to the deputation which came from the Senate and Chamber at Turin in honor of so great an event as the union of southern with northern Italy under the constitutional rule of one sovereign. On December 1st, Victor Emmanuel embarked for Palermo, where he was received with an enthusiasm of at least as great as that which marked his arrival in Naples. In the capital of Sicily, all orders of citizens pressed forward to pay him their willing homage. These great results were not, however, achieved without difficulty, for there was considerable diversity of opinion and not a little jealousy between those that surrounded Garibaldi and those that followed the lead of Cavour in Parliament and in the country. Nor can it be denied that faults and mistakes may fairly be laid to the charge of both of these parties, despite their sincere attachment to the cause of their common fatherland. A mistake was made by Garibaldi himself when he wished to postpone the immediate annexation of the southern provinces to the northern kingdom, and asked to be named dictator of Naples for 2 years by Victor Emmanuel, whom he further requested to dismiss Cavour and his actual advisers. The king rightly refused to agree to a course so subversive of all constitutional proceedings and liberties. He could not even entertain the idea of dismissing ministers at the request of any citizen, however illustrious, or however great the services he had rendered his country. It was for the national representatives alone to decide to what minister the king should give his confidences, and what course should be taken as to the annexation of Naples and Sicily. Garibaldi's good sense and honesty of purpose led him to give in to the king's judgment. Victor Emmanuel took the right view of the course to be pursued in this matter, just as he had taken the right view of the course to be pursued at the moment of the peace of Villafranca. In the one case, he showed himself wiser than Cavour, and in the other, wiser than Garibaldi. The single-minded patriotism of the latter and the statesmanship of the former, combined with the remarkably sure judgment and unfailing honesty of the king, gradually overcame all the difficulties of the situation. Victor Emmanuel ever kept aloof from political coteries, while deferring to the advice of his responsible ministers so long as they had the confidence of Parliament. He ever showed himself to be the head of the nation, not the head of a party. His unswerving determination to be guided by the nation's will as expressed by the nation's chosen representatives, though nothing new in his career, won for him the absolute confidence of all Italians, not one of whom avowed it more frankly than Garibaldi himself. But what shall be said of the popular hero, sprung from the ranks of the people, who had given a kingdom to his sovereign? Rarely, if ever, has history recorded nobler conduct than that of the conqueror of Sicily and Naples, when, having liberated those provinces, he laid down all power, refused all honors, turned away alike wealth and titles, to betake himself to his island home of Caprera, there to work with his own hands, to rejoice as he thought of how greatly he had advanced the independence of Italy, and to pray for the hour of its completion. Whatever defects may be found in the character or judgment of this heroic patriot, his name will assuredly be held in grateful remembrance wherever men are found who love freedom and rejoice as they see its blessings spread more and more among the nations of the earth. As Garibaldi retired to his quiet abode in Caprera, Victor Emmanuel returned to his duties in Turin, but neither the one nor the other forgot Rome and Venice. The siege of Gaeta was now being carried forward with great determination. The place was defended with courage and endurance by Francis II and his queen. For a time the French fleet prevented the Italians from attacking Gaeta by sea, but when Napoleon withdrew his ships, further resistance became hopeless. On February 13, 1861, Gaeta surrendered after a defense of which those who took part in it had a right to be proud. The garrison marched out with the honors of war, the officers retained their rank. Francis and his wife embarked for Terracina, went thence to Rome, where they were received by the Pope and lodged in the Quirinal Palace. The citadels of Messina and of Civitella del Tronto surrendered soon after, and so passed away forever the rule of the Neapolitan Bourbons over the kingdom of the Two Sicilies. No less than 22 millions of Italians were now united under the scepter of Victor Emmanuel, who, in accordance with the advice of his prime minister, Count Cavour, dissolved the parliament. The new election took place at the end of January 1861. The constitution as established in Sardinia was put in force from Turin to Palermo. At the same time, the king nominated, as suggested by his responsible advisers, 60 new senators or members of the upper house. They were selected chiefly among the most prominent and influential men of the provinces of central and southern Italy. The elections were everywhere favorable to the new order of things, namely, the formation of the single kingdom of Italy under the constitutional rule of Victor Emmanuel. The majority of the new chamber gave a hearty support to Count Cavour. On February 18, 1861, the first Italian parliament, representing all the provinces of Italy, Venetia and the Roman patrimony alone excepted, assembled in the Palazzo Carignano at Turin. The title assumed by the king in concert with his ministers in parliament was, quote, Victor Emmanuel II, by the grace of God and the will of the nation, Kingdom of Italy. Unquote. End of section 31.
Section 32 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17, by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Emancipation of Russian Serfs, A.D. 1861, by Andrew D. White and Nikolai Turgenieff. Part 1. By the act that freed the serfs in Russia Alexander II, to whom it was in great measure due, obtained a place of unusual honor among the sovereigns that have ruled his nation. It was the grand achievement of Alexander's reign, and caused him to be hailed as one of the world's liberators. The importance of this event in Russian history is not diminished by the fact that its practical benefits have not as yet been realized to the full extent anticipated. In 1888, Stepniak, the Russian author and reformer, declared that emancipation had utterly failed to realize the ardent expectations of its advocates and promoters, had failed to improve the material condition of the former serfs, who on the whole were worse off than before emancipation. The same assertion has been made with respect to the emancipation of slaves in the United States, but in neither case does the objection invalidate the historical significance of an act that formally liberated millions of human beings from hereditary and legalized bondage. In the two views here presented, the subject of the emancipation in Russia is considered in various aspects. Andrew D. White's account being that of an American scholar and diplomatist familiar with the history and people of Russia through his residence at St. Petersburg, is of peculiar value, embodying the most intelligent foreign judgment. White's synopsis covers the entire subject of the serf system, from its beginning to its overthrow. Nikolai Turgenieff, the Russian historian, writing while the Emancipation Act was bearing its first fruits, describes its workings and effects as observed by one intimately connected with the serfs and the movement that resulted in their freedom. Andrew D. White. Close upon the end of the 15th century, the Muscovite ideas of right were subjected to the strong mind of Ivan the Great and compressed into a code. Therein were embodied the best processes known to his land and time for discovering crime, torture, and trial by battle; for punishing crime, the knout and death. But hidden in this tough mass was one law of greater import than others. Thereby were all peasants forbidden to leave the lands they were then tilling, except during the 8 days before and after St. George's Day. This provision sprang from Ivan's highest views of justice and broadest views of political economy. The nobles received it with plaudits, which have found echoes even in these days. The peasants received it with no murmurs, which history has found any trouble in drowning. Just 100 years later, upon the Muscovite throne, as nominal Tsar, sat the weakling Fyodor I, but behind the throne stood, as real Tsar, hard, strong Boris Godunov. Looking forward to Fyodor's death, Boris made ready to mount the throne, and he saw, what all other mayors of the palace climbing into the places of Fainon kings have seen, that he must link to his fortunes the fortunes of some strong body in the nation. He broke, however, from the general rule among usurpers, bribing the church, and determined to bribe the nobility. The greatest grief of the Muscovite nobles seemed to be that the peasants could escape from their oppression by the emigration allowed on St. George's Day. Boris saw his opportunity. He cut off the privilege of St. George's Day, and the peasant was fixed to the soil forever. No Russian law ever directly enslaved the peasantry, but through this decree of Boris, the lord who owned the soil came to own the peasants, just as he owned its immovable boulders and ledges. To this the peasants submitted, but history has not been able to drown their sighs over this wrong. Their proverbs and ballads make St. George's Day representative of all ill luck and disappointment. A few years later, Boris made another bid for oligarchic favor. He issued a rigorous fugitive serf law, and even wrenched liberty from certain free peasants who had entered service for wages before his edicts. This completed the work, and Russia, which never had had the benefits of feudalism, had now fastened upon her feudalism's worst curse, a serf caste, bound to the glebe. The great good things done by Peter the world knows by heart. The world knows well how he tore his way out of the fetishism of his time, how, despite ignorance and unreason, he dragged his nation after him, how he dowered the nation with things and thoughts that transformed it from a petty Asiatic horde to a great European power. We were present a few years since, when one of those lesser triumphs of his genius was first unfolded. It was in that room at the Hermitage, adjoining the Winter Palace, set apart for the relics of Peter. Our companions were two men noted as leaders in American industry, one famed as an inventor, the other famed as a champion of inventors' rights. Suddenly, from the inventor, pulling over some old dust-covered machines in a corner, came loud cries of surprise. The cries were natural indeed. In that heap of rubbish he had found a lathe for turning irregular forms, and a screw-cutting engine once used by Peter himself. Specimens of his unfinished work were still in them. They had lain there unheeded 150 years. Their principle had died with Peter and his workmen, and not many years since they were reinvented in America, and gave their inventors fame and fortune. At the late Paris Universal Exposition, crowds flocked about an American lathe for copying statuary, and that lathe was, in principle, identical with this old forgotten machine of Peter's. Yet, though Peter fought so well and thought so well, he made some mistakes, which hang to this day over his country as bitter curses. For in all his plan and work to advance the mass of men was one supreme lack of any account of the worth and right of the individual man. Lesser examples of this are seen in his grim jest at Westminster Hall. What use of so many lawyers? I have but 2 lawyers in Russia, and one of those I mean to hang as soon as I return. Or when in Berlin, having been shown a new gibbet, he ordered one of his servants to be hanged in order to test it. Or in his review of parade fights, when he ordered his men to use ball and to take the buttons off their bayonets. Greater examples are seen in his Battle of Narva, when he threw away an army to learn his opponent's game; in his building of St. Petersburg, where, in draining marshes, he sacrificed 100,000 men the first year. But the greatest proof of this great lack was shown in his dealings with the serf system. Serfage was already recognized in Peter's time as an evil. Peter himself once stormed forth in protestations and invectives against what he stigmatized as selling men like beasts, separating parents from children, husbands from wives, which takes place nowhere else in the world, and which causes many tears to flow. He declared that a law should be made against it. Yet it was by his misguided hand that serfage was compacted into its final black mass of foulness. For Peter saw other nations spinning and weaving, and he determined that Russia should at once spin and weave. He saw other nations forging iron, and he determined that Russia should at once forge iron. He never stopped to consider that what might cost little in other lands as a natural growth might cost far too much in Russia as a forced growth. In lack then of quick brain and sturdy spine and strong arm of paid workmen, he forced into his manufactories the flaccid muscle of serfs. These, thus lifted from the earth, lost even the little force in the state they had before. Great bodies of serfs thus became slaves. Worse than that, the idea of a serf developed toward the idea of a slave. And Peter, misguided, dealt one blow more. Cold-blooded officials were set at taking the census. These adopted easy classifications. Free peasants, serfs, and slaves were often huddled into the lists under a single denomination, so serfage became still more difficult to be distinguished from slavery. As this base of hideous wrong was thus widened and deepened, the nobles built higher and stronger their superstructure of arrogance and pretension. Not many years after Peter's death, they so overawed the Empress Anne that she thrust into the codes of the empire statutes which allowed the nobles to sell serfs apart from the soil. So did serfage bloom fully into slavery. But in the latter half of the 18th century, Russia gained a ruler from whom the world came to expect much. To mount the throne, Catherine II had murdered her husband. To keep the throne, she had murdered two claimants whose title was better than her own. She then became, with her agents in these horrors, a second Messalina. To set herself right in the eyes of Europe, she paid eager court to that hierarchy of skepticism which in that age made or marred European reputations. She flattered the fierce deist by owning fealty to Le Roi Voltaire. She flattered the mild deist by calling in La Harpe as the tutor of her grandson. She flattered the atheists by calling in Diderot as a tutor for herself. Her murders and orgies were soon forgotten in the new hopes for Russian regeneration. Her dealings with Russia strengthened these hopes. The official style required that all persons presenting petitions should subscribe themselves "Your Majesty's humble serf." This formula she abolished, and boasted that she had cast out the word serf from the Russian language. Poets and philosophers echoed this boast over Europe, and the serfs waited. The great empress spurred hope by another movement. She proposed to an academy the question of serf emancipation as a subject for their prize essay. The essay was written and crowned. It was filled with beautiful things about liberty, practical things about moderation, flattering things about the great Catherine, and the serfs waited. Again she aroused hope. It was given out that her most intense delight came from the sight of happy serfs and prosperous villages. Accordingly, in her journey to the Crimea, Potemkin squandered millions on millions in rearing pasteboard villages, in dragging forth thousands of wretched peasants to fill them, in costuming them to look thrifty, in training them to look happy. Catherine was rejoiced. Europe sang paeans. The serfs waited. She seemed to go further. She issued a decree prohibiting the enslavement of serfs. But unfortunately the palace intrigues, and the correspondence with the philosophers, and the destruction of Polish nationality left her no time to see the edict carried out. But Europe applauded, and the serfs waited. 2 years after this came a deed which put an end to all this uncertainty. An edict was prepared ordering the peasants of Little Russia to remain forever on the estates where the day of publication should find them. This was vile, but what followed was diabolic. Court pets were let into the secret. These, by good promises, enticed hosts of peasants to their estates. The edict was now sprung. In an hour the courtiers were made rich, the peasants were made serfs, and Catherine II was made infamous forever. So about a century after Peter, a wave of wrong rolled over Russia that not only drowned honor in the nobility, but drowned hope in the people. As Russia entered the 19th century, the hearts of earnest men must have sunk within them. For Paul I, Catherine's son and successor, was infinitely more despotic than Catherine, and infinitely less restrained by public opinion. He had been born with savage instincts, and educated into ferocity. Tyranny was written on his features in his childhood. If he remained in Russia, his mother sneered and showed hatred of him. If he journeyed in Western Europe, crowds gathered about his coach to jeer at his ugliness. Most of those who have seen Gilray's caricature of him, issued in the height of English spite at Paul's homage to Bonaparte, have thought it hideously overdrawn. But those who have seen the portrait of Paul in the Cadet Corps of St. Petersburg know well that Gilray did not exaggerate Paul's ugliness, for he could not. And Paul's face was but a mirror of his character. Tyranny was wrought into his every fibre. He demanded an oriental homage. As his carriage whirled by, it was held the duty of all others in carriages to stop, descend into the mud, and bow themselves. Himself threw his despotism into this formula: "Know, Sir Ambassador, that in Russia there is no one noble or powerful except the man to whom I speak, and while I speak." And yet within that hideous mass glowed sparks of reverence for right. When the nobles tried to get Paul's assent to more open arrangements for selling serfs apart from the soil, he utterly refused. And when they overtasked their human chattels, Paul made a law that no serf should be required to give more than 3 days in the week to the tillage of his master's domain. But within 5 years after his accession, Paul had developed into such a ravenous wild beast that it became necessary to murder him. This duty done, there came a change in the spirit of Russian sovereignty, as from March to May. But sadly for humanity, there came at the same time a change in the spirit of European politics, as from May to March. For although the new Tsar, Alexander I, was mild and liberal, the storm of French ideas and armies had generally destroyed in monarchs' minds any poor germs of philanthropy which had ever found lodgment there. Still Alexander breasted this storm, found time to plan for his serfs, and in 1803 put his hand to the work of helping them toward freedom. His first edict was for the creation of the class of free laborers. By this, masters and serfs were encouraged to enter into an arrangement which was to put the serf into immediate possession of himself, of a homestead, and of a few acres, giving him time to indemnify his master by a series of payments. Alexander threw his heart into this scheme, and in his kindliness he supposed that the pretended willingness of the nobles meant something. But the serf-owning caste, without openly opposing, twisted up bad consequences with good, braided impossibilities into possibilities. The whole plan became a tangle, and was thrown aside. The Tsar now sought to foster other good efforts, especially those made by some earnest nobles to free their serfs by will. But this plan also the serf-owning caste entangled and thwarted. At last the storm of war set in with such fury that all internal reforms must be lost sight of. Russia had to make ready for those campaigns in which Napoleon gained every battle. Then came that peaceful meeting on the raft at Tilsit, worse for Russia than any warlike meeting, for thereby Napoleon seduced Alexander for years from plans of bettering his empire into dreams of extending it. Coming out of these dreams, Alexander had to deal with such realities as the burning of Moscow, the Battle of Leipzig, and the occupation of France. Yet in the midst of those fearful times, when the grapple of the emperors was at the fiercest, in the very year of the burning of Moscow, Alexander rose in calm statesmanship, and admitted Bessarabia into the empire under a proviso which excluded serfage forever. Hardly was the great European tragedy ended when Alexander again turned sorrowfully toward the wronged millions of his empire. He found that progress in civilization had but made the condition of the serfs worse. The newly ennobled parvenus were worse than the old boyars. They hugged the serf system more lovingly and the serfs more hatefully. The sight of these wrongs roused him. He seized a cross and swore that the serf system should be abolished. Straightway a great and good plan was prepared. Its main features were a period of transition from serfage to personal liberty, extending through 12 or 14 years, the arrival of the serf at personal freedom, with ownership of his cabin and the bit of land attached to it, the gradual reimbursement of masters by serfs, and after this advance to personal liberty, an advance by easy steps to a sort of political liberty. Favorable as was this plan to the serf owners, they attacked it in various ways, but they could not kill it utterly. Estonia, Livonia, and Courland became free. Having failed to arrest the growth of freedom, the serf-holding caste made every effort to blast the good fruits of freedom. In Courland they were thwarted. In Estonia and Livonia they succeeded during many years. But the eternal laws were too strong for them, and the fruitage of liberty had grown richer and better. After these good efforts, Alexander stopped, discouraged. A few patriotic nobles stood apart from their caste and strengthened his hands, as Lafayette and Lincourt strengthened Louis XVI. They even drew up a plan of voluntary emancipation, formed an association for the purpose, and gained many signatures. But the great weight of that besotted serf-owning caste was thrown against them, and all came to naught. Alexander was at last walled in from the great object of his ambition. Pretended theologians built, between him and emancipation, walls of scriptural interpretation. Pretended philosophers built walls of false political economy. Pretended statesmen built walls of sham common sense. If the Tsar could but have mustered courage to cut the knot! Alas for Russia and for him! He wasted himself in efforts to untie it. His heart sickened at it. He welcomed death, which alone could remove him from it. Alexander's successor, Nicholas I, had been known before his accession as a mere martinet, a good colonel for parade days, wonderful in detecting soiled uniforms, terrible in administering petty punishments. It seems like the story of stupid Brutus over again. Altered circumstances made a new man of him, and few things are more strange than the change wrought in his whole bearing and look by that week of energy in climbing his brother's throne. The great article in Nicholas's creed was a complete, downright faith in despotism, and in himself as despotism's apostle. Hence he hated above all things a limited monarchy. He told de Custine that a pure monarchy or pure republic he could understand, but that anything between these he could not understand. Of his former rule of Poland as constitutional monarch he spoke with loathing. Of this hate which Nicholas felt for liberal forms of government there yet remain monuments in the great museum of the Kremlin. That museum holds an immense number of interesting things, and masses of jewels and plate which make all other European collections mean. The visitor wanders among clumps of diamonds and sacks of pearls, and a nauseating wealth of rubies and sapphires and emeralds. There rise rows upon rows of jeweled scimitars, and vases and salvers of gold, and old saddles studded with diamonds and with stirrups of gold, presents of frightened Asiatic satraps or fawning European allies. There, too, are the crowns of Muscovy, of Russia, of Kazan, of Astrakhan, of Siberia, of the Crimea, and, pity to say it, of Poland. And next this is an index of despotic hate, for the Polish scepter is broken and flung aside. Near this stands the full-length portrait of Alexander I, and at his feet are grouped captured flags of Hungary and Poland, some with blood marks still upon them. But below all, far beneath the feet of the emperor, in dust and ignominy, and on the floor, is flung the very constitution of Poland, parchment for parchment, ink for ink, good promise for good promise, which Alexander gave with so many smiles, and which Nicholas took away with so much bloodshed. And not far from this monument of the deathless hate Nicholas bore that liberty he had stung to death, stands a monument of his admiration for straightforward tyranny, even in the most dreaded enemy his house ever knew. Standing there is a statue in the purest of marble, the only statue in those vast halls. It has the place of honor. It looks proudly over all that glory, and keeps ward over all that treasure. And that statue, in full majesty of imperial robes, and bees, and diadem, and face, is of the first Napoleon. Admiration of his tyrannic will has at last made him peaceful sovereign of the Kremlin. This spirit of absolutism took its most offensive form in Nicholas's attitude toward Europe. He was the very incarnation of reaction against revolution, and he became the demigod of that horde of petty despots who infest Central Europe. Whenever then any tyrant's lie was to be baptized, he stood its godfather. Whenever any god's truth was to be crucified, he led on those who passed by, reviling and wagging their heads. Whenever these oppressors revived some old feudal wrong, Nicholas backed them in the name of religion. Whenever their nations struggled to preserve some great right, Nicholas crushed them in the name of law and order. With these pauper princes his children intermarried, and he fed them with his crumbs and clothed them with scraps of his purple. The visitor can see today, in every one of their dwarf palaces, some of his malachite vases, or porcelain bowls, or porphyry columns. But the people of Western Europe distrusted him as much as their rulers worshipped, and some of these same presents to their rulers have become trifle monuments of no mean value, in showing that popular idea of Russian policy. Foremost among these stand those two bronze masses of statuary in front of the royal palace at Berlin, representing fiery horses restrained by strong men. Pompous inscriptions proclaim these presents from Nicholas. But the people, knowing the man and his measures, have fastened upon one of these curbed steeds the name of Progress Checked, and on the other Retrogression Encouraged. A few days before Nicholas's self-will brought him to his deathbed, we saw him ride through the St. Petersburg streets with no pomp and no attendants, yet in as great pride as ever despotism gave a man. At his approach, nobles uncovered and looked docile. Soldiers faced about and became statues. Long-bearded peasants bowed to the ground with the air of men on whose vision a miracle flashes. For there was one who could make or mar all fortunes, the absolute owner of street and houses and passers-by, one who owned the patent and dispensed the right to tread that soil, to breathe that air, to be glorified in that sunlight and amid those snow crystals. And he looked at all. Though at that moment his army was entrapped by military stratagem, and he himself was entrapped by diplomatic stratagem, that face and form were proud and confident as ever. There was in this attitude toward Europe, in this standing forth as the representative man of absolutism, and breasting the 19th century, something of greatness. But in his attitude toward Russia, this greatness was wretchedly diminished. For as Alexander I was a good man, enticed out of goodness by the baits of Napoleon, Nicholas was a great man, scared out of greatness by the ever-recurring phantom of the French Revolution. In those first days of his reign, when he enforced loyalty with grape-shot and halter, Nicholas dared much and stood firm, but his character soon showed another side. Fearless as he was before bright bayonets, he was an utter coward before bright ideas. He laughed at the flash of cannon, but he trembled at the flash of a new living thought. Whenever, then, he attempted a great thing for his nation, he was sure to be scared back from its completion by fear of revolution. And so today he who looks through Russia for Nicholas's works finds a number of great things he had done, but each is single, insulated, not preceded logically, not followed effectively. Take as an example of this his railway building. His own pride and Russian interest demanded railways. He scanned the world with that keen eye of his, saw that American energy was the best supplement to Russian capital. His will darted quickly, struck afar, and Americans came to build his road from St. Petersburg to Moscow. Nothing can be more complete. It is an air-line road, and so perfect that the traveler finds few places where the rails do not meet, before and behind him in the horizon. The track is double, the rails very heavy and admirably ballasted. Station houses and engine houses are splendid in build, perfect in arrangement, and surrounded by neat gardens. The whole work is worthy of the pyramid builders. The traveler is whirled by culverts, abutments, and walls of dressed granite, through cuttings where the earth on either side is carefully paved or turfed to the summit. Ranges of Greek columns are reared as crossings in the midst of broad marshes. Lions' heads in bronzed iron stare out upon vast wastes where never rose even the smoke from a serf's kennel. End of section 32. Section 33 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17, by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Emancipation of Russian Serfs, Part 2. All this seems good, and a ride of 400 miles through such glories rarely fails to set the traveler at chanting the praises of the emperor who conceived them. But when the traveler notes that complete isolation of the work from all conditions necessary to its success, his praises grow fainter. He sees that Nicholas held back from continuing the road to Odessa, though half the money spent in making the road an imperial plaything would have built a good, solid extension to that most important seaport. He sees that Nicholas dared not untie police regulations, and that commerce is wretchedly meager. Contrary to what would obtain under a free system, this great public work found the country wretched and left it wretched. The traveler flies by no ranges of trim palings and tidy cottages. He sees the same dingy groups of huts here as elsewhere, the same cultivation looking for no morrow, the same tokens that the laborer is not thought worthy of his hire, this same tendency to great single works, this same fear of great connected systems, this same timid isolation of great creations from principles essential to their growth, is seen too in Nicholas's church building. Foremost of all the edifices on which Nicholas lavished the wealth of the empire stands the Isaac Church in St. Petersburg. It is one of the largest and certainly the richest cathedral in Christendom. All is polished pink granite and marble and bronze. On all sides are double rows of titanic columns, each a single block of polished granite with bronze capital. Colossal masses of bronze statuary are grouped over each front. High above the roof, and surrounding the great drums of the domes, are lines of giant columns in granite, bearing giant statues in bronze, and crowning all rises the vast central dome, flanked by its 4 smaller domes, all heavily plated with gold. The church within is one gorgeous mass of precious marbles and mosaics, and silver and gold and jewels. On the tabernacle of the altar, in gold and malachite, on the screen of the altar, with its pilasters of lapis lazuli, and its range of malachite columns 50 feet high, were lavished millions on millions. Bulging from the ceilings are massy bosses of Siberian porphyry and jasper. To decorate the walls with unfading pictures, Nicholas founded an establishment for mosaic work, where 60 pictures were commanded, each demanding, after all artistic labor, the mechanical labor of 2 men for 4 years. Yet this vast work is not so striking a monument of Nicholas's luxury as of his timidity. For this cathedral and some others almost as grand were, in part at least, results of the deep wish of Nicholas to wean his people from their semi-idolatrous love for dark, confined, filthy sanctuaries like those of Moscow. But here again is a timid purpose and half result. Nicholas dared set no adequate enginery working at the popular religious training or moral training. There had been such an organization, the Russian Bible Society, favored by Alexander I, but Nicholas swept it away at one stroke of the pen. Evidently he feared lest scriptural denunciations of certain sins in ancient politics might be popularly interpreted against certain sins in modern politics. The corruption system in Russia is old, organized, and respectable. Stories told of Russian bribes and thefts exceed belief only until one has been on the ground. Nicholas began well. He made an imperial progress to Odessa, was welcomed in the morning by the governor in full pomp and robes, and flow of smooth words, and at noon the same governor was working in the streets with ball and chain as a convict. But against such a chronic moral evil no government is so weak as your so-called strong government. Nicholas set out one day for the Kronstadt arsenals to look into the accounts there, but before he reached them, stores, storehouses, and account books were in ashes. So at last Nicholas folded his arms and wrestled no more. For apart from the trouble, there came ever in his dealings with thieves that old timid thought of his, that if he examined too closely their chief tenure, they might examine too closely his despot tenure. We have shown this vague fear in Nicholas's mind thus at length, and in different workings, because thereby alone can be grasped the master key to his dealings with the serf system. Toward his toiling millions, Nicholas always showed sympathy. Let news of a single wrong to a serf get through the hedges about the Russian majesty, and woe to the guilty master. Many of these wrongs came to Nicholas's notice, and he came to hate the system and try to undermine it. Opposition met him, of course. Not so much the ponderous laziness of Peter's time as an opposition, polite and elastic, which never ranted and never stood up, for then Nicholas would have throttled it and stamped upon it. But it did its best to entangle his reason and thwart his action. He was told that the serfs were well fed, well housed, well clothed, well provided with religion, were contented, and had no wish to leave their owners. Now Nicholas was not strong at spinning sham reasons, nor subtle at weaving false conscience. But to his mind the very fact that the system had so degraded a man that he could laugh and dance and sing while other men took his wages, his wife, and homestead, was the crowning argument against the system. Then the political economists beset him, proving that without forced labor Russia must sink into sloth and poverty. Yet all this could not shut out from Nicholas's sight the great black fact in the case. He saw, and winced as he saw, that while other European nations, even under despots, were comparatively active and energetic, his own people were sluggish and stagnant; that although great thoughts and great acts were towering in the West, there were in Russia, after all his galvanizing, no great authors or scholars, or builders or inventors, but only two main products of Russian civilization, dissolute lords and abject serfs. Nearly 20 years went by in this timid dropping of grains of salt into a putrid sea. But at last, in 1842, Nicholas issued his ukase, creating the class of contracting peasants. Masters and serfs were empowered to enter into contracts, the serf receiving freedom, the master receiving payment in installments. It was a moderate innovation, very moderate, nothing more than the first failure of the first Alexander. Yet even here that old timidity of Nicholas nearly spoiled what little good was hidden in the ukase. Notice after notice was given to the serf owners that they were not to be molested, that no emancipation was contemplated, and that the ukase contained nothing new. The result was as feeble as the policy. A few serfs were emancipated, and Nicholas halted. The revolutions of 1848 increased his fear of innovation, and finally the war in the Crimea took from him the power of innovation. The great man died. We saw his cold, dead face in the midst of crowns and crosses, very pale then, very powerless then. One might stare at him, then, as at a serf's corpse, for he who had scared Europe during 30 years lay before us that day as a poor lump of chilled brain and withered muscle. And we stood by when, amid chanting and flare of torches and roll of cannon, his sons wrapped him in his shroud of gold thread and lowered him into the tomb of his fathers. But there was shown in those days far greater tribute than the prayers of bishops or the reverence of ambassadors. Massed about the Winter Palace and the fortress of Peter and Paul stood thousands on thousands, who in far distant serf huts had put on their best, had toiled wearily to the capital to give their last mute thanks to one who for years had stood between their welfare and their owner's greed. Sad that he had not done more, yet they knew that he had wished their freedom and loathed their wrongs, for that came up the tribute of millions. The new emperor, Alexander II, had never been hoped for as one who could light the nation from his brain. The only hope was that he might warm the nation somewhat from his heart. He was said to be of a weak, silken fiber. The strength of the family was said to be concentrated in his younger brother, Constantine. But soon came a day when the young Tsar revealed to Europe not merely kindliness, but strength. While his father's corpse was still lying within his palace, he received the diplomatic body. As the emperor entered the audience room, he seemed feeble indeed for such a crisis. That fearful legacy of war seemed to weigh upon his heart. Marks of plenteous tears were upon his face. Nesselrode, though old and bent and shrunk in stature, seemed stronger than his young master. But as he began his speech, it was seen that a strong man had mounted the throne. With earnestness he declared that he sorrowed over the existing war, but that, if the Holy Alliance had been broken, it was not through the fault of Russia. With bitterness he turned toward the Austrian minister, Esterhazy, and hinted at Russian services in 1848, and Austrian ingratitude. Calmly, then, not as one who spoke apart, but as one who announced a determination, he declared, "I am anxious for peace, but if the terms at the approaching Congress are incompatible with the honor of my nation, I will put myself at the head of my faithful Russia, and die sooner than yield." Strong as Alexander showed himself by these words, he showed himself stronger by acts. A policy properly mingling firmness and conciliation brought peace to Europe, and showed him equal to his father. A policy mingling love of liberty with love of order brought the dawn of prosperity to Russia, and showed him the superior of his father. The reforms now begun were not stinted as of old, but free and hearty. In rapid succession were swept away restrictions on telegraphic communication, on printing, on the use of the imperial library, on strangers entering the country, on Russians leaving the country. A policy in public works was adopted which made Nicholas's greatest efforts seem petty. A vast network of railways was begun. A policy in commercial dealings with Western Europe was adopted, in which Alexander, though not apparently so imposing as Nicholas, was really far greater. He dared advance toward freedom of trade. But soon rose again that great problem of old, that problem ever rising to meet a new autocrat, and at each appearance more dire than before, the serf question. The serfs in private hands now numbered more than 20 millions. Above them stood more than 100,000 owners. The princely strength of the largest owners was best represented by a few men possessing over 100,000 serfs each, and above all by Count Sheremetyeff, who boasted 300,000. The luxury of the large owners was best represented by about 4,000 men possessing more than 1,000 serfs each. The pinching propensities of the small owners were best represented by 50,000 men possessing fewer than 20 serfs each. The serfs might be divided into two great classes. The first comprised those working under the old or corvée system, giving usually 3 days in the week to the tillage of the owner's domain. The second comprised those working under the new or obrok system, receiving a payment fixed by the owner and assessed by the community to which the serfs belonged. The character of the serfs had been molded by the serf system. They had a simple shrewdness which under a better system had made them enterprising. But this quality soon degenerated into cunning and cheatery, the weapons which the hopelessly oppressed always use. They had a reverence for things sacred, which under a better system might have given the nation a strengthening religion. But they now stood among the most religious peoples on earth, and among the least moral. To the picture of Our Lady of Kazan they were ever ready to burn wax and oil. To truth and justice they constantly omitted the tribute of mere common honesty. They kept the church fasts like saints. They kept the church feasts like satyrs. They had curiosity, which under a better system would have made them inventive. But their plough, in common use, was behind the plough described by Virgil. They had a love of gain, which under a better system would have made them hard working. But it took 10 serfs to do, languidly and poorly, what 2 free men in America would do quickly and well. They were naturally a kind people. But let one example show how serfage can transmute kindness. It is a rule well known in Russia that when an accident occurs, interference is to be left to the police. Hence you would see a man lying in a fit, and the bystanders giving no aid, but waiting for the authorities. Some years ago, as all the world remembers, a theater took fire in St. Petersburg, and crowds of people were burnt or stifled. The whole story is not so well known. The theater was but a great temporary wooden shed, such as is run up every year at the holidays in the public squares. When the fire burst forth, crowds of peasants hurried to the spot. But though they heard the shrieks of the dying, separated from them only by a thin planking, only one man in that multitude dared cut through and rescue some of the sufferers. The serfs, when standing for great ideas, would die rather than yield. Napoleon I learned this at Eylau. Napoleon III learned it at Sebastopol. Yet in daily life they were slavish beyond belief. On a certain day, in the year 1855, the most embarrassed man in all Russia was doubtless our excellent American minister. The serf coachman, employed at wages, was called up to receive his discharge for drunkenness. Coming into the presence of a sound-hearted American Democrat, who never had dreamed of one mortal kneeling to another, Ivan throws himself on his knees, presses his forehead to the minister's feet, fawns like a tamed beast, and refuses to move until the minister relieves himself from this nightmare of servility by a full pardon. Time after time we have entered the serf field and serf hut, have seen the simple round of serf toils and sports, have heard the simple chronicles of self-joys and sorrows. But whether his livery were filthy sheepskin or gold-laced caftan, whether he lay on carpets at the door of his master, or in filth on the floor of his cabin, whether he gave us cold, stupid stories of his wrongs, or flippant details of his joys, whether he blessed his master or cursed him, we have wondered at the power which a serf system has to degrade and imbrute the image of God. But astonishment was increased 1,000-fold at study of the reflex influence for evil upon the serf owners themselves, upon the whole free community, upon the very soil of the whole country. On all those broad plains of Russia, on the daily life of that serf-owning aristocracy, on the whole class, which was neither of serfs nor serf-owners, the curse of God was written in letters so big and so black that all mankind might read them. Farms were untilled, enterprise deadened, invention crippled, education neglected. Life was of little value. Labor was the badge of servility, laziness the very badge and passport of gentility. Despite the most specious half-measures, despite all efforts to galvanize it, to coax life into it, to sting life into it, the nation remained stagnant. Not one traveler who does not know that the evils brought on that land by the despotism of the autocrat were as nothing compared to that dark network of curses spread over it by a serf-owning aristocracy. Into the conflict with this evil Alexander II entered manfully. Having been 2 years upon the throne, having made a plan, having stirred some thought through certain authorized journals, he inspired the nobility in 3 of the northwestern provinces to memorialize him in regard to emancipation. Straightway an answer was sent, conveying the outlines of the emperor's plan. The period of transition from serfage to freedom was set at 12 years. At the end of that time the serf was to be fully free, and possessor of his cabin, with an adjoining piece of land. The provincial nobles were convoked to fill out these outlines with details as to the working out by the serfs of a fair indemnity to their masters. The whole world was stirred, but that province in which the Tsar hoped most eagerly for a movement to meet him, the province where beat the old Muscovite heart, Moscow, was stirred least of all. Every earnest throb seemed stifled there by that strong aristocracy. Yet Moscow moved at last. Some nobles who had not yet arrived at the callous period, some professors in the university who had not yet arrived at the heavy period, breathed life into the mass, dragged on the timid, fought off the malignant. The movement had soon a force which the retrograde party at Moscow dared not openly resist. So they sent answers to St. Petersburg, apparently favorable. But wrapped in their phrases were hints of difficulties, reservations, impossibilities. All this studied suggestion of difficulties profited the reactionists nothing. They were immediately informed that the imperial mind was made up, that the business of the Muscovite nobility was now to arrange that the serf be freed in 12 years and put in possession of homestead and enclosure. The next movement of the retrograde party was to misunderstand everything. The plainest things were found to need a world of debate. The simplest things became entangled. The noble assemblies played solemnly a ludicrous game of cross purposes. Straightway came a notice from the emperor, which, stripped of official verbiage, said that they must understand. This set all in motion again. Imperial notices were sent to province after province. Explanatory documents were issued. Good men and strong were set to talk and work. The nobility of Moscow made another move. To scare back the advancing forces of emancipation, they elected as provincial leaders 3 nobles bearing the greatest names of old Russia and haters of the new ideas. To defeat these came a successor of Saint Gregory and Saint Bavon, one who accepted the thought that when God advances great ideas, the Church must marshal them. Filaret, Metropolitan of Moscow, upheld emancipation and condemned its foes. His earnest eloquence carried all. The work progressed unevenly. Nobles in different governments differed in plan and aim. An assembly of delegates was brought together at St. Petersburg to combine and perfect a resultant plan under the eye of the emperor. The Grand Council of the Empire, too, was set at the work. It was a most unpromising body, yet the emperor's will stirred it. The opposition now made the most brilliant stroke of its campaign. Just as James II of England prated of toleration and planned the enslavement of all thought, so now the bigoted plotters against emancipation began to prate of constitutional liberty. But Alexander held right on. It was even hinted that visions of a constitutional monarchy pleased him. But then came tests of Alexander's strength far more trying. Masses of peasants, hearing vague news of emancipation, learning doubtless from their masters' own spiteful lips that the emperor was endeavoring to tear away property in serfs, took the masters at their word and determined to help the emperor. They rose in insurrection. To the bigoted serf owners this was a godsend. They paraded it in all lights. Therewith they threw life into all the old commonplaces on the French Revolution. Timid men of good intentions wavered. The Tsar would surely now be scared back. Not so. Alexander now hurled his greatest weapon, and stunned reaction in a moment. He freed all the serfs on the imperial estates without reserve. Now it was seen that he was in earnest. The opponents were disheartened. Once more the plan moved and dragged them on. But there came other things to dishearten the emperor, and not least of these was the attitude of those who molded popular thought in England. Be it said here, to the credit of France, that from her came constant encouragement in the great work. Walowski, Mezad, and other true-hearted men sent forth from leading reviews and journals words of sympathy, words of help, words of cheer. Not so England. Just as in the French Revolution of 1789, while yet that revolution was noble and good, while yet Lafayette and Bailly held it, leaders in English thought, who had quickened the opinions which had caused the revolution, sent malignant prophecies and prompted foul blows. So in this battle of Alexander against a foul wrong, they seized this time of all times to show all the wrongs and absurdities of which Russia ever had been or ever might be guilty, criticized, carped, sent much haughty advice, depressing sympathy, and malignant prophecy. Review articles, based on no real knowledge of Russia, announced a desire for serf emancipation, and then, in the modern English way, with plentiful pyrotechnics of antithesis and paradox, threw a gloomy light into the skillfully pictured depths of imperial despotism, official corruption, and national bankruptcy. They revived old-world objections, which, to one acquainted with the most everyday workings of serfage, were ridiculous. It was said that if the serfs lost the protection of their owners, they might fall a prey to rapacious officials. As well might it have been argued that a mother should never loose her son from her apron strings. It was said that serfism excludes pauperism, that if the serf owes work to his owner in the prime of life, the owner owes support to his serf in the decline of life. No lie could be more absurd to one who has seen Russian life. We were first greeted on entering Russia by a beggar who knelt in the mud. At Kovno 18 beggars besieged the coach, and Kovno was hardly worse than scores of other towns. Within a day's ride from St. Petersburg, a woman begged piteously for means to keep soul and body together, and finished the refutation of that sonorous English theory, for she had been discharged from her master's service in the metropolis as too feeble, and had been sent back to his domain afar in the country, on foot and without money. It was said that freed peasants would not work. But despite volleys of predictions that they would not work if freed, despite volleys of assertions that they could not work if freed, the peasants, when set free and not crushed by regulations, have sprung to their work with an earnestness, and continued it with a vigor, at which the philosophers of the old system stand aghast. The freed peasants of Vologda compare favorably with any in Europe. And when the old tirades have grown stale, English writers draw copiously from a new source, from La Vérité sur la Russie, pleasingly indifferent to the fact that the author's praise in a previous work had notoriously been a thing of bargain and sale, and that there was, in full process of development, a train of facts which led the Parisian courts to find him guilty of demanding in one case a blackmail of 50,000 roubles. All this argument outside the empire helped the foes of emancipation inside the empire, but the emperor met the whole body of his opponents with an argument overwhelming. On March 5, 1861, he issued his manifesto making the serfs free. He had struggled long to make some satisfactory previous arrangement. His motto now became, "Emancipation first, arrangement afterward." Thus was the result of the great struggle decided. End of section 33. Section 34 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17, by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Emancipation of Russian Serfs, Nikolai Turgenieff. In 1857, the Emperor Alexander II first raised the question of emancipation and declared it was time for it to be accomplished. As might have been expected, the idea of emancipation met with great opposition from different sides. Yet the opposition was directed not so much against the personal emancipation of the serfs as against the appropriation to them, when liberated, of the land they held. The proprietors, assembled in different committees, which were established all over the empire to discuss the matter, ended even by giving up their right of possession in the person of the serf, and mentioning only their right to the land occupied by the peasants, claimed pecuniary indemnities if that land were delivered to them. The honorable gentlemen whom the emperor entrusted with this important task, forming a committee ad hoc, declared from the first, as a principle, that the emancipated peasants must have land, about in the same quantity as they had hitherto occupied, on condition of a pecuniary indemnity to be paid to the proprietors. That principle prevailed, thanks to the emperor's firmness. During the discussion of that question in Russia, I published several writings on the matter. My chief purpose and warmest desire being to secure to the peasants as soon as possible their personal freedom and complete liberty of labor, I proposed a method of emancipation, claiming the entire property of their homes, that is to say, cottages and orchards, and a small quantity of arable land, and that without the slightest indemnity from them to their masters, which was to be left to the government. A sum of about $200 millions, according to my calculation, would have been sufficient for it. Meanwhile, I inherited a small landed property, inhabited by about 400 persons of both sexes. I hastened to put in practice my method. I abandoned 1/3 of the land, including their houses, to the peasants, and let them the 2 remaining thirds for a certain sum of money. In my agreement with them, it was settled that, if the emancipation which the government was preparing, 1859, turned out more advantageous to them, they were to accept it in preference to mine. It is needless to add that, when the official emancipation was proclaimed, the peasants and I found it more advantageous and adopted it. If I were to compare the two methods, I should say that mine tended chiefly to the liberty of the peasant's person and labor, and that of the government to give them a quantity of land sufficient for their subsistence. The great inconvenience of this last method was that it obliged the peasants to pay a heavy rent to redeem their land, and that during 49 years. Nevertheless, their passion to possess land was so strong that they cheerfully submitted to such hard conditions. The redeeming rent de rachat, was to be paid by the peasants, either in money, according to an estimate fixed by law, or by work done for the proprietor, i.e., by corvée. This last mode of payment, sanctioned by law only for a short period, disappeared more and more every day, so that the majority of the peasants no longer worked for the proprietors, but paid their rent in money. I can say more. About 2,000,000 of peasants were entirely liberated with regard to the proprietors, thanks to an immediate payment of the redeeming rent. In such cases their annual rent, redevance, was capitalized, and the government gave the proprietor an obligation for the amount of the capital, which bore 5% interest, and was to be redeemed in the course of 49 years by annual drawings, tirage. The peasants then to pay their redeeming rent to government, and thus become free and independent proprietors. For some time both peasants and proprietors seemed to find this proceeding the most profitable, and agreements of this kind became more and more frequent every day. I can hardly say how happy I was when I saw for the first time my dear beloved and deeply respected Russian peasants free at last, and proprietors of the land they had till then cultivated as serfs. What a change! The same creatures, serfs yesterday, became men, conscious of their human dignity. Their aspect, their language, are those of free men. In the meanwhile, in getting rid of their serfdom, they preserved their usual good sense, wisdom, and bonhomie. No impertinence, no arrogance whatsoever can be detected in them. They are full of self-respect, yet polite. I saw them discussing with the authorities some business of theirs. They maintained their new rights, and when wrong, never hesitated to acknowledge it. Every district and every chef-lieu had every year an assembly of deputies, who named a permanent committee for 3 years. This committee was charged with the municipal administration, under the control of the assembly. Everyone was called by law to the election of the deputies. It happened in many places that the peasants were the more numerous, and could therefore dispose of all the places in the administrative committee. They were so informed. "No," was their answer, "we want 1 or 2 members of the committee taken from among ourselves. They will watch over our interests. As for defending them, as for action, the nobles we name will do it better than we, for they are more learned than we are." In one of the assemblies, the nobles, moved by the tact and moderation of the peasants, insisted and almost forced a peasant to become president of the administrative committee of the district. When the salary of the members of the committee had to be decided, the peasants usually considered it too high for them, and letting the nobles and the merchants have it, got it diminished by 1/2 for themselves. All the district assemblies, after voting for the formation of the administrative committee, named the deputies for the larger assembly in the chief town in the province, which, in its turn, chose among its own members the members for the provincial administrative committee. The central committee seemed to interest the peasants less than those of the districts, and this too is owing to their modesty and moderation. Another field was offered by the new law to the activity of the peasants in the local or municipal tribunals. The law united several rural communes in one canton, volost. Each canton, each commune, chose an ancien, assisted by a conseil. In every canton was a tribunal to judge the peasants' affairs. Ancients and judges were elected by peasants. Noblemen were not submitted to these tribunals, but it has happened that some of them preferred having their difficulties with peasants settled by municipal judges rather than by the usual tribunals. This jurisdiction, established merely for peasants, had great importance, owing chiefly to the privilege of deciding not only according to general law, but also according to local customs. Opportunities were not wanting for the good sense of the peasants to show itself in these municipal tribunals and councils, and the success of the institution was clear to everyone. End of section 34. End of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 17, by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd.